Nutria. Have you ever seen a beaver's smaller, scruffier cousin with giant orange teeth? Meet the nutria, also called the koi pool, an animal that looks like it belongs in a Disney movie, but acts like a bulldozer with fur. At first glance, they seem pretty harmless. They're kind of cute, actually. They hang out in rivers and ponds, munching away on plants. But here's the twist. These guys are basically demolition crews for wetlands. Nutria aren't even supposed to be in most of the places where they live now. They're originally from South America, but in the late 1800s and early 1900s, fur traders thought they'd be a genius idea. They were brought to the U.S., Europe, and even parts of Asia so people could farm them for their soft, water-resistant fur. But fur fashion didn't stay popular forever. When the market collapsed, the nutria were either released or escaped into the wild. And they thrived. And here's why that's a problem. Nutria eat a lot. They don't just nibble the tops of plants. They go for the roots, ripping up entire plants from underneath the soil. Wetlands survive because those plants hold the mud together like a living net. Without the roots, the soil just washes away. This isn't a small problem either. In Louisiana, for example, nutria are estimated to destroy tens of thousands of acres of marshland every year. Imagine a forest being bulldozed, but instead of bulldozers, you have chubby little rodents doing it with their teeth. It doesn't just stop at plants. Nutria also compete with native muskrats and beavers, which play important roles in wetland ecosystems. They destroy crops too. Rice, corn, sugarcane, anything they can shoot through. And when they're done eating, they dig massive burrows into levees, canals, and dikes, weakening flood control systems. That means more risk of flooding in places that are already vulnerable. You might think, okay, why not just trap them all? Well, here's the kicker. Nutria reproduce like crazy. A single female can have up to 3 litters a year, with as many as 13 babies per litter. That's dozens of new wetland records every year from just one mama nutria. Hunting and bounty programs exist. Louisiana even pays people per nutria tail they turn in. But keeping the population under control is a never-ending battle. And here's the spooky part. Scientists warn that nutria aren't just a local problem anymore. With climate change warming northern regions, their range is expanding. They've been spotted as far north as Washington State, and even the UK is trying to wipe them out before they spread again. If we don't get a handle on them, whole wetlands could vanish, and with them the fish, birds, and protection those wetlands provide against storms. So the next time you see a cute, whiskered critter swimming by, remember that little face might be the reason an entire marsh disappears.
Rhesus macaques. Picture this. You're paddling down a beautiful Florida river, soaking in the sunshine, when suddenly a troop of monkeys appears on the riverbank, staring at you. Sounds like a scene from a movie, right? But nope, this is a real thing. Florida has wild monkeys, and not just any monkeys. They're rhesus macaques, and they've got a dangerous secret. Some of them carry herpes B virus, which can be fatal to humans. So how on earth did monkeys end up living in the sunshine state? It all started back in the 1930s when a man nicknamed Colonel Toohey decided Florida's Silver Springs would be a great tourist attraction if it had monkeys. He brought in a few rhesus macaques from Asia and released them on an island in the river. What he didn't realize is that rhesus macaques are excellent swimmers. They didn't stay on the island. They spread all over. And of course, they started doing what monkeys do best, having more monkeys. At first, people thought it was kind of charming. Who wouldn't want to see monkeys on a boat tour? But over time, things got complicated. For one thing, these monkeys aren't just hanging out minding their business. They raid campsites, steal food, and sometimes get aggressive toward humans. They also eat bird eggs, small animals, and compete with native wildlife for food. Florida's ecosystems are already under siege from invasive pythons, iguanas, and king toads, and now monkeys are in the mix too. But here's where it gets scary. About 25% of the monkeys tested carry herpes B virus. Now in monkeys, this virus doesn't really do much. It's kind of like a mild cold sore. But in humans, it can be deadly. The virus can cause severe brain inflammation and has a mortality rate of around 70% if untreated. And it's not like you have to be bitten to catch it. Contact with saliva, urine, or feces can be enough. Considering these monkeys have been seen throwing poop at tourists, yes, seriously, that's not exactly comforting. Attempts to remove or sterilize the population have been messy, both literally and politically. Some people argue the monkeys should be captured or culled to protect public health. Others say they're a part of Florida's quirky identity now and should be left alone. Meanwhile, the population keeps growing and the monkeys are spreading beyond Silver Springs into nearby forests and neighborhoods. Scientists are worried this situation is a ticking bomb, not just for humans, but for Florida's wildlife. The monkeys could compete with endangered species for resources or spread new diseases. The longer they stay, the harder it will be to ever get rid of them.
European rabbits. Rabbits are adorable, right? Little nose twitches, floppy ears, soft fur. What's not to love? Well, if you're an Australian farmer in the 1800s, the answer is everything. This is the story of how a handful of cute bunnies turned into hundreds of millions of ecological vandals, chewing their way across an entire continent and leaving devastation in their wake. It all started in 1859, when a man named Thomas Austin thought it would be fun to bring some rabbits from England to his estate in Victoria
so he could hunt them. He released just 24 rabbits into the wild. What could go wrong, right? Well, Australia turned out to be rabbit paradise. No predators, mild winters, endless grasslands, and plenty of room to multiply. And multiply they did, faster than anyone could have imagined. Within decades, their numbers exploded into the hundreds of millions. Here's the problem with rabbits. They aren't casual grazers. They don't just nibble and move on. They eat plants right down to the roots, which prevents them from growing back. That might not sound like a big deal until you scale it up to millions of rabbits eating like this day after day. Vast areas of farmland and native grasslands were stripped bare. Without plant cover, soil eroded, turning huge sections of Australia into dusty, lifeless plains. This wasn't just bad for farmers, it was catastrophic for native wildlife. Species like the bilby and bandicoot, which depended on that same vegetation, started to decline sharply. Even livestock suffered because there simply wasn't enough pasture left. It's estimated that by the early 1900s, rabbits were costing the Australian economy millions every year, and that's in 1900s money. So, Australia fought back. They built the world's longest fence, the famous rabbit-proof fence, stretching over 1,100 miles across Western Australia. The idea was to keep rabbits out of farmland by physically blocking them. Sounds clever, but rabbits are tenacious. They dug under, found gaps, and kept spreading. Then came biological warfare. In the 1950s, scientists released the myxoma virus, which was deadly to rabbits but harmless to other animals. At first, it was a miracle cure. Rabbit numbers crashed by 99%. But nature always fights back. And, over time, the rabbits developed resistance. Populations began to climb again. Later, another virus, calicivirus, or RHDV, was released in the 1990s, and that also knocked numbers down. But again, not permanently. Today, rabbits are still one of the biggest invasive species problems in Australia. They cost the country hundreds of millions in agricultural damage each year, and continue to threaten native plants and animals. The fight isn't over, but one thing is clear. Thomas Austin's Little Hunting Project turned into one of the biggest ecological disasters in history. So, yeah, next time you see a cute bunny in your yard, just be glad there aren't 200 million of them eating everything in sight.
Feral cats. Cats. We love them. The internet practically runs on cat videos. But put those same fluffy predators on an island, and they turn into one of the most efficient killing machines nature has ever seen, wiping out bird species that survived for millions of years. This story starts with us, of course. Wherever humans went, explorers, sailors, colonists, we brought cats along. At first, it was practical. Cats were supposed to keep rats and mice under control on ships. When people settled on islands, they let the cats roam to handle pests. The cats did their job, sure, but they also started hunting everything else. The thing about islands is that native animals often evolved with no big predators around. Many island birds don't even fly anymore because they never had to. They just nested on the ground, living the easy life.
That's basically like putting up a glowing neon sign for cats that says, "Free buffet." Once the cats were loose, the extinctions began. Scientists estimate that feral cats are responsible for the extinction of at least 33 bird species, including several types of flightless rails. They've also wiped out reptiles, small mammals, and even insects on some islands. On Marion Island, near Antarctica, for example, cats were killing an estimated 450,000 seabirds a year. Imagine that! Nearly 500,000 birds gone annually because of a few thousand cats. And cats aren't just a problem on remote islands. They're devastating in places like New Zealand, where native birds like the kiwi evolved with no mammalian predators at all. Even pet cats that are allowed outside take a toll. Studies show that house cats in some areas kill millions of birds and small animals each year. Feral colonies with no one feeding or controlling them do far worse. Efforts to deal with the problem have been intense. Some islands have launched full-scale eradication programs using traps, hunting, and even specially trained dogs to remove every last cat. It's not easy. Cats are clever, and if even a few survive, they can repopulate quickly. But on islands where eradication has been successful, the results are incredible. Bird populations bounce back, ecosystems start healing, and species thought to be nearly extinct start breeding again. Of course, these programs are controversial. Some people hate the idea of killing cats, even feral ones. But conservationists argue that it's the only way to prevent entire species from disappearing forever. On some islands, they've managed to trap and relocate cats instead of killing them. But this is expensive and not always practical on a large scale. So next time you see a cute kitty on the internet, remember, on islands around the world, their wild cousins are quietly reshaping entire ecosystems, one bird at a time. They're not just predators, they're extinction-level events.
Ship rats. Imagine sailing to a tiny, untouched island in the middle of the ocean. It's full of nesting seabirds, the air is thick with calls, the ground is covered with eggs. It's paradise. Now imagine that paradise going silent because a few rats hitched a ride on a ship hundreds of years ago. That's the story of the black rat, also called the ship rat, one of the world's most destructive stowaways. Ship rats are originally from Asia, but they became global travelers thanks to humans. Wherever ships went, explorers, traders, pirates, rats went too, hiding in cargo holds, living off scraps, and disembarking when they smelled land. By the time humans had mapped most of the world, black rats had quietly colonized it. Here's why they're so devastating, especially on islands. Seabirds often nest on the ground and lay just one egg per season. They evolved on islands with no mammalian predators, so they didn't develop defenses against sneaky, nocturnal rodents. Enter the ship rat, an expert climber, strong jumper, and relentless gnawer. They raid nests, eat eggs, kill chicks, and even attack adult birds while they sleep. The result? Entire seabird colonies collapse in just a few years. Some islands that were once deafening with bird calls have gone eerily silent. Scientists actually call this the island night silence. It's creepy. And it's not just birds that suffer. Rats also eat seeds, seedlings, reptiles, insects, even crabs, completely changing how the island's ecosystem works. There are some jaw-dropping examples. On Lord Howe Island in Australia, ship rats caused the extinction of at least 5 bird species and 2 mammals within a few decades of their arrival. On islands in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, populations of rare storm petrels and shearwaters have been wiped out. Even the Galapagos Islands, home to some of the rarest wildlife on Earth, have battled rat invasions for years. So what do we do about it? Well, some of the biggest conservation projects in history have been aimed at getting rid of rats on islands. This usually involves dropping poisoned bait by helicopter over the entire island, a controversial but surprisingly effective method. On South Georgia Island, near Antarctica, one of the largest rat eradication efforts ever was launched, and it worked. The birds are coming back, and chicks are hatching safely for the first time in decades. But here's the tricky part. It's a race against time. Every year that rats remain on an island, more birds vanish, and ecosystems get pushed closer to collapse. And because rats are so widespread, total eradication globally isn't possible. The best we can do is protect the most critical islands before it's too late. So the next time you see a little rat scurry across a street, think about this. Its ancestors may have changed the soundscape of entire oceans, from deafening bird calls to dead silence. Red fox. Picture the Australian outback at night, quiet, moonlit, with little marsupials like bilbies and bettongs, hopping around, digging for food. Now, imagine a pair of glowing eyes watching from the brush. In creeps a red fox, silent and clever, and within seconds, that little marsupial is gone. This is the story of how a predator from half a world away became one of the greatest threats to Australia's unique wildlife. Red foxes aren't native to Australia. They're from Europe, Asia, and North America, where they're part of the natural balance. But in the mid-1800s, British settlers in Australia wanted a taste of home, including their favorite pastime, fox hunting. So they imported red foxes, thinking it would be fun to chase them on horseback. What they didn't think about was the fact that Australia's native animals had no defenses against a smart, fast, night-hunting predator. The impact was almost immediate and absolutely devastating. Small and medium-sized marsupials, creatures like quolls and numbats and bandicoots, started disappearing fast. These animals evolved on a continent with very few mammalian predators, and none like the fox. They had no natural fear of something that stalked quietly at night and pounced with deadly precision. Today, red foxes are found across most of the Australian mainland, and they're blamed for the decline or extinction of at least 20 native mammal species. In fact, ecologists say that foxes, along with feral cats, are the main reason so many of Australia's marsupials are endangered. Even animals as large as young kangaroos can fall victim to foxes. And because foxes are opportunistic, they also eat reptiles, insects, birds, and even farm animals like lambs, causing economic damage too. Australia has been fighting back for decades, but foxes are hard to control. They're clever, adaptable, and reproduce quickly. Traditional hunting barely makes a dent. Poison baits, especially one called 1080, which is deadly to foxes but less harmful to native animals, have been one of the main tools for control. Fencing projects have also been built to create safe zones where endangered marsupials can live without predators. Inside these fenced areas, species that were almost extinct are breeding again, a rare bit of good news in this story. But outside the fences, the battle continues. Foxes are so widespread that total eradication is nearly impossible. Instead, the goal is to keep their numbers low enough to give native animals a fighting chance. Some areas even use guardian dogs, like Maremma sheepdogs, to protect endangered birds and mammals by keeping foxes away. The red fox might be beautiful, with its bushy tail and sly face, but in Australia, it's a top-tier villain. It has completely reshaped the nighttime ecosystem, turning once safe landscapes into danger zones for native animals. And unless humans stay one step ahead, the silent hunt will go on, one marsupial at a time. Gray squirrels. When you picture a squirrel in a British park, you're probably imagining a plump, gray little acrobat darting up a tree. But here's a twist. Those gray squirrels aren't native to the UK at all. They're actually invaders from North America, and their presence has turned into one of the most heartbreaking conservation battles in the country, the fight to save the native red squirrel. Gray squirrels were first introduced to England in the late 1800s as a novelty by wealthy landowners who thought they were charming additions to their estates. For a while, it seemed harmless, but gray squirrels are bigger, tougher, and way more adaptable than red squirrels. They breed faster, eat more, and can digest food that reds can't, like acorns high in tannins. That gave them a huge advantage. Over time, gray squirrels spread across most of England, Wales, and parts of Scotland, pushing red squirrels out. But it's not just competition for food and space that's the problem. Gray squirrels also carry a virus called squirrel pox. They don't get sick from it, but when red squirrels catch it, it's almost always fatal, killing them in just a couple of weeks. That means even when there's enough food for everyone, reds are still in trouble. The result has been devastating. Red squirrels, once common across the UK, have disappeared from most of their range. Today, there are only about 120,000 red squirrels left in the UK, compared to more than 2.5 million gray squirrels. In some places, it's been described as a quiet takeover. Within just a few years of gray squirrels arriving, red populations can collapse by 90%. Conservationists haven't given up, though. There are projects all over the UK trying to save the red squirrel by controlling gray squirrel populations. In some areas, this means trapping or culling grays to give reds a fighting chance. In others, they've reintroduced red squirrels into protected areas where grays are kept out. Scotland still has some strongholds where red squirrels thrive, and volunteers work hard to monitor for gray squirrel incursions. And there's a glimmer of hope on the science front, too. Researchers are exploring vaccines for squirrelpox that could help protect reds. Others are studying natural predators like pine martens, a small weasel-like carnivore, which seem to prefer hunting gray squirrels over red ones. In areas where pine martens have returned, red squirrel numbers are actually bouncing back. It's a fascinating and bittersweet story. One cute, fluffy animal accidentally driving another to the brink. For many people in the UK, red squirrels are a symbol of a wilder past, immortalized in children's books like Beatrix Potter's Squirrel Nutkin. Whether they'll survive outside protected pockets depends on whether humans, and maybe pine martens, can keep the grays in check. So next time you see a gray squirrel happily raiding a park bird feeder, remember, that little thief is part of one of Britain's most dramatic wildlife rivalries.
Imagine waking up to find your carefully planted field torn apart overnight, like someone drove a plow through it. Only it wasn't a tractor, it was a herd of feral pigs. That's the reality for farmers and landowners across huge parts of the United States. These aren't the cute, pink pigs you see in cartoons. These are tough, tusked, 200-pound bulldozers that rip through ecosystems, spread disease, and eat pretty much anything they can find. Feral pigs are actually just domestic pigs that have gone wild, mixed with imported wild boar from Europe and Asia. When settlers first brought pigs to North America in the 1500s, they often let them roam freely, figuring they could round them up later. Some escaped, bred in the wild, and over centuries created a population of super-adapted, free-ranging hogs. Today, there are an estimated 6 million feral pigs across the U.S., with populations in at least 35 states. Here's the problem. Pigs are like living rototillers. They root through soil with their snouts looking for roots, grubs, and tubers, tearing up entire pastures, forests, and wetlands in the process. This destroys native plants, accelerates erosion, and can even turn clear streams into muddy messes. It's like having a construction crew working 24/7 with no plan to rebuild what they wreck. And they don't just damage plants, they eat anything they find. Feral pigs are opportunistic omnivores, which means ground-nesting birds, turtle eggs, amphibians, and even small mammals are all on the menu. In some areas, they've been blamed for wiping out rare species of salamanders and causing declines in wild turkey populations. Then there's the disease factor. Feral pigs can carry more than 30 different diseases and parasites, including brucellosis, pseudorabies, and swine fever, which can threaten livestock, pets, and even people. They contaminate crops with their waste, making them a nightmare for farmers trying to sell food for human consumption. The damage isn't small. It's estimated that feral pigs cause over $2.5 billion in damage every year in the U.S. That's crops destroyed, fences broken, water systems wrecked, and hours of labor lost trying to repair the mess. So what's being done?
Well, there are huge control programs involving trapping, aerial hunting from helicopters, and even specially trained pig dogs used to round them up. But the problem is, pigs reproduce incredibly fast. A single sow can have 2 litters a year, with 6 to 12 piglets each time. That means populations can bounce back almost as fast as they're culled. Feral pigs are here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. Some experts call them the most destructive invasive species in the U.S. The challenge now is figuring out how to control their numbers enough to keep them from wrecking entire ecosystems without causing new problems in the process. So next time you picture a pig, don't think of Charlotte's Web. Think of a tank with a snout tearing up the countryside one root at a time.
Small Indian mongoose. Picture a cane field in the Caribbean in the late 1800s. Farmers are desperate. Rats are eating their sugar cane and ruining their livelihoods. So someone comes up with what sounds like a genius plan. Bring in a fierce little predator from India called the small Indian mongoose to hunt the rats. Problem solved, right? Well, not exactly. That plan turned into one of the most infamous invasive species disasters in history. The small Indian mongoose is a sleek, weasel-like animal with quick reflexes, sharp teeth, and a reputation for being a snake killer. Farmers in the Caribbean, Hawaii, and even parts of Japan imported them by the dozens and released them into fields, expecting them to wipe out the rats. What they didn't account for is that mongooses are daytime hunters, while rats are mostly nocturnal. Translation: the mongooses didn't even eat that many rats. But they did find plenty of other things to eat. And this is where the story gets dark. Mongooses are opportunistic predators. They'll eat eggs, chicks, lizards, frogs, crabs, and even insects. On islands where animals evolved with no mammalian predators, this was catastrophic. Ground-nesting birds had no chance. Species like the Hawaiian petrel, the nene goose, and many island reptiles started disappearing. To give you an idea of the scale of the damage, in Jamaica alone, mongooses are blamed for contributing to the decline of several native snakes and lizards, including the critically endangered Jamaican boa. In Hawaii, they've become one of the biggest threats to endangered seabirds and native amphibians. On some Pacific islands, biologists have found that up to 70% of ground-nesting bird nests fail because mongooses raid them. And here's the thing. Once mongooses are established, they're almost impossible to get rid of. They reproduce quickly, several litters a year. They're fast and they're clever. Trapping programs exist, but you'd need an army of traps running constantly just to keep their numbers in check. Poisoning is difficult too, because you risk harming non-target species. Some islands have fought back successfully, though. On small, isolated islands where eradication was possible, removing mongooses has led to dramatic recoveries of native birds. But on big islands, like those in Hawaii or the Caribbean, total eradication isn't realistic, at least not yet.
The story of the small Indian mongoose is one of those classic cases of humans thinking they can outsmart nature and getting burned. The very creature they brought in to save their crops ended up becoming an ecological disaster that continues more than a century later. So, next time you hear the word mongoose, don't just think of the heroic snake fighter from the Jungle Book. Think of a lightning-fast little invader that turned Paradise Islands into silent hunting grounds.
Feral dogs. When you think of dangerous animals in India, you probably picture tigers, leopards, maybe even elephants. But here's a surprise. One of the most disruptive predators on the subcontinent isn't a wild animal at all. It's the feral dog. These are the descendants of abandoned or free-roaming domestic dogs, and they've quietly become a major force in India's ecosystems, threatening wildlife and even people. Feral dogs are everywhere. Cities, villages, mountains, even remote forests. In India alone, there are an estimated 60 million free-roaming dogs, many of them living without human care. Some form packs that hunt cooperatively, and that's where things get really serious. Unlike pets, feral dogs don't stick to scraps and garbage. They go after wildlife, chasing and killing animals for sport as much as for food. In some regions, feral dogs have been filmed chasing endangered blackbucks, chinkaras, and even snow leopards, harassing them until they abandon their kills. For a snow leopard, which works hard to bring down a blue sheep in the thin mountain air, losing a meal to a pack of dogs is a big deal. It wastes energy and puts their survival at risk. Ground-nesting birds, small mammals, and reptiles are also easy prey. In some protected areas, dogs have been blamed for wiping out entire generations of vulnerable species. And it's not just the direct killing. Dogs spread diseases like rabies, distemper, and parvovirus to wild animals. These diseases can be devastating to endangered populations that have no immunity. In some tiger reserves, rabies outbreaks have been a serious concern because even a few infected dogs could transmit the virus to big cats. The problem isn't just ecological, it's public health, too. India accounts for around 36% of the world's rabies deaths, and most of those cases come from dog bites. Feral dogs also cause injuries to livestock, leading to big economic losses for farmers. Controlling the population is a massive challenge. Culling dogs is controversial and often faces public backlash since many people feed and care for local street dogs. There are programs for mass sterilization and vaccination, but with such a huge population, progress is slow. Some conservationists are calling for stricter measures around wildlife reserves, including removing dogs from protected areas entirely. This is a tough one, because we're talking about an animal that humans domesticated thousands of years ago, our closest companion now becoming an ecological threat.
It's a story about how our actions ripple out in ways we don't always expect. So, the next time you see a pack of stray dogs trotting along a road in rural India, remember those friendly-looking animals might be playing a much bigger role in the survival or extinction of some of the rarest wildlife on Earth.
European starlings. Picture Central Park in New York City in the 1890s. A man in a top hat stands proudly, holding a cage full of small, glossy blackbirds. His dream? To introduce every bird mentioned in the works of Shakespeare to America. Sounds poetic, right? But that little idea turned into one of the biggest bird invasions in history. And now, more than a century later, there are over 200 million European starlings across North America. The man's name was Eugene Schieffelin, and in 1890 and 1891, he released about 100 starlings into Central Park. He probably thought it would be beautiful to hear the same birdsong Shakespeare heard in England. What he didn't realize was that starlings are absolute survival machines. They're smart, aggressive, and incredibly adaptable. Fast forward to today, those 100 birds turned into a continent-wide population that stretches from Alaska to Mexico. Starlings gather in massive flocks called murmurations, sometimes numbering in the hundreds of thousands, creating stunning aerial displays that look like living clouds. But behind that beauty is a dark side. Starlings compete fiercely with native birds for nesting sites. They'll kick bluebirds, woodpeckers, and swallows out of tree cavities, sometimes even killing chicks in the process. They raid crops, eating fruit and grain by the ton. It's estimated that starlings cause hundreds of millions of dollars in agricultural damage every year in the U.S. And because they form such huge flocks, they can create real hazards for airplanes. The infamous 1960 crash of an Eastern Airlines flight in Boston was caused by a starling flock getting sucked into the engines, killing 62 people. And it's not like you can just get rid of them. Starlings are incredibly good at surviving. They thrive in cities, farms, suburbs, basically anywhere humans live. They eat almost anything, breed prolifically, and are smart enough to avoid traps. Some control efforts involve scaring them off with loud noises or using netting around crops, but full eradication is pretty much impossible at this point. There's also a weird cultural divide about them. Some people hate starlings for what they do to native wildlife. Others admire them for their intelligence, their mimicry. They can copy car alarms, human speech, and other birds, and those breathtaking murmurations that go viral online. But one thing's for sure. Eugene Schieffelin's little experiment permanently changed North America's bird population. A few cages of birds turned into a flying army that now shapes entire ecosystems. So next time you see a flock of shiny, speckled birds filling the sky, remember, that's Shakespeare's legacy soaring over your head, and it's not going away anytime soon.
Common miners. If you've ever sat at an outdoor cafe in Australia and had a bold little brown bird hop right onto your table to steal a French fry, chances are you've met the common myna. They're clever, chatty, and not shy around humans, which might sound fun at first, but in Australia, they've earned a much nastier nickname, flying rats, and for good reason. Common mynas aren't native to Australia. They originally come from South Asia and were introduced in the late 1800s to control agricultural pests like locusts and caterpillars. Sounds familiar, right? Just like the mongoose story. But as always, nature had other plans. Instead of just helping farmers, the mynas spread rapidly through cities and farmland, taking over nesting hollows and driving native birds out. See, mynas are aggressive and territorial. They don't just look for empty nesting spots, they'll actively evict other birds from theirs. They attack rainbow lorikeets, rosellas, and kookaburras, even tossing eggs and chicks out to claim the space. And since tree hollows take decades to form, competition for them is fierce. When mynas muscle their way in, native species often have nowhere else to go. The problem doesn't stop at nesting sites. Mynas also form large, noisy roosts, sometimes thousands of birds crammed into one area. They're loud enough to keep entire neighborhoods awake, and their droppings can spread diseases like salmonella and mites, which affect both humans and other animals. Their aggressive behavior and constant presence even stress out native bird populations, reducing their breeding success over time. And while they are often seen in cities, they're not just an urban problem. In rural areas, they can damage fruit crops, spread invasive plant seeds, and disrupt natural ecosystems. They've become one of the most widely distributed invasive birds in Australia, with populations still growing. So what do you do about a bird that's this good at thriving? Some regions have started community trapping programs where residents can humanely capture mynas and remove them from the population. There are also efforts to install nesting boxes designed specifically for native birds with entry holes too small for mynas to use. But controlling them is tough. Mynas are smart. They quickly learn to avoid traps if they see other birds caught. And because they reproduce quickly, several broods per year, even a small surviving population can bounce back fast. For many Australians, common mynas are a symbol of how human-introduced species can take over so fast it feels unstoppable. They're not just a nuisance, they're changing the balance of which species get to call the treetops home. So, the next time you see a cheeky little bird strutting around a cafe table, remember, it might look harmless, but out in the bush, its relatives are busy kicking native birds out of their homes one hollow at a time.
Rose-ringed parakeets. If you're strolling through a park in London, Paris, or even Berlin, and suddenly hear tropical squawking overhead, no, you're not hallucinating. Those bright green birds you see zipping between trees are rose-ringed parakeets. And yes, they're wild. Europe has somehow ended up with flocks of parrots. And while they might look charming, they're starting to cause real trouble. Rose-ringed parakeets are native to Africa and South Asia, but their European story begins with us, as usual. Since the 1960s, they've been popular pets, and many either escaped or were released into the wild. Urban legend even claims some escaped from the set of a Humphrey Bogart movie, or from shipping crates at Heathrow Airport. Whatever the truth, they found European cities surprisingly comfortable. Plenty of food, few predators, and warm enough winters to survive. Fast forward to today,
And there are now tens of thousands of these birds living across Europe, from London's suburbs to Rome's parks. They've become so common that some cities feel like they have their own little piece of the Amazon. But there's a catch. Parakeets are cavity nesters, which means they need tree hollows or holes to raise their chicks. The problem? Native species, like woodpeckers, nuthatches, and even bats, also need those same hollows. And parakeets are, frankly, pushy. They'll take over tree holes, sometimes attacking the birds that were already nesting there. In some studies, parakeets have been caught on camera physically evicting woodpeckers, even pulling chicks out of nests. The result is a slow but steady shift in who gets to live in those precious cavities. Woodpeckers, already limited by the number of mature trees available, are losing ground. Other small birds that depend on abandoned woodpecker holes also suffer. It's a chain reaction. And because parakeets nest in large numbers, they can monopolize most of the available hollows in a park or forest edge. There are other impacts, too. Parakeets raid orchards and vineyards, eating fruit and damaging crops. Their loud squawking can disturb other wildlife. And in some areas, they gather in huge, noisy roosts, thousands of birds in one spot, leaving behind a mess of droppings that damages cars, statues, and buildings. Cities are starting to think about management strategies, but parakeets are charming to many people, and culling them is controversial. Some researchers are exploring nest box designs that exclude parakeets but allow native birds, while others are studying whether natural predators like hawks can keep their numbers in check. So next time you see a flash of green in a European park, remember you're looking at one of the most successful avian squatters in history. They might make the city sound like a rainforest, but they're quietly pushing the natives out of their homes, one tree hollow at a time. House crows. Picture a busy East African port city. Perched on the rooftops and telephone wires, you'll see sleek black and gray birds watching everything like little feathered gangsters. These are house crows, and while they might look like any ordinary crow, they've become one of the most invasive, disruptive birds along the Indian Ocean coast. House crows are originally from the Indian subcontinent, where they've lived alongside humans for centuries. They're incredibly smart and adaptable, thriving anywhere people are. But they didn't stop at India. Thanks to shipping routes, they started hitching rides on boats in the 19th and 20th centuries, arriving in ports from East Africa to the Middle East. Once they got there, they settled in, and their numbers exploded. Why ports? Because ports are a buffet. Fish scraps, grain, garbage, open markets, all easy pickings for a clever crow. But house crows don't just eat trash. They also raid nests, eat eggs and chicks, and harass native corvids like ravens and raptors until they abandon their territories. In some East African cities, house crows have completely displaced native crow species, outcompeting them for food and nesting space. And they don't stop at other birds. They can also be a problem for humans. Large flocks roosting in cities create a constant racket, leave droppings everywhere, and can spread diseases through their waste. They've even been known to snatch food straight out of people's hands or dive-bomb picnickers. Farmers hate them because they damage crops, pulling up seedlings or eating ripening fruit. But the biggest issue is their sheer numbers. A single breeding pair can raise several chicks a year. And with plenty of food in urban areas, their survival rates are high. Within a few decades of arriving, they can take over entire towns. Some port cities have reported tens of thousands of house crows, creating what's been called avian chaos. Efforts to control them included trapping, poisoning, and even shooting. But crows are clever. Once they figure out an area is dangerous, they avoid it. Long-term solutions may involve reducing the food waste that allows them to thrive. But that's easier said than done in busy, growing cities. What's fascinating, and a little scary, is that house crows are still spreading. They've reached new ports in recent decades, and scientists worry they could become a problem for more coastal regions if left unchecked. So the next time you're near an East African harbor and you see a crow boldly strutting around like it owns the place, it kind of does. These birds have turned ports into their personal kingdoms, pushing out the natives and ruling the rooftops like feathery mob bosses.
Canada geese. If you've ever walked through a park in Europe and been hissed at by a big black-necked goose blocking the path, congratulations, you've met one of the most successful avian invaders around, the Canada goose. These birds might look elegant gliding across a pond, but in large numbers they turn into loud, honking lawn mowers with wings, and Europe has more of them every year. Canada geese are, unsurprisingly, native to North America. They were first brought to the UK in the 17th century as ornamental birds for wealthy estates and hunting parks. At first they were rare and considered a novelty, but as with many introductions, they didn't stay confined for long. They escaped, bred, and quickly figured out that Europe's mild climate and endless parks, golf courses, and wetlands were perfect for year-round living. Here's the thing. Canada geese are grazers, and voracious ones at that. They can strip grasslands and wetlands bare, eating aquatic vegetation down to the roots. This overgrazing damages habitats for native birds, amphibians, and insects that rely on dense plant cover. In sensitive wetlands, too, too many geese can literally change the shape of the ecosystem, turning lush marshes into muddy wastelands. And then there's the poop. A single Canada goose produces up to 1 kilogram of droppings per day, and in large flocks, that's a lot of waste hitting the ground and the water. This nutrient overload pollutes ponds and lakes, encouraging algae blooms that choke out fish and other aquatic life. Plus, walking through a park littered with goose droppings is nobody's idea of fun. Their aggressive behavior is another issue.
Canada geese are fiercely protective during nesting season and will charge at humans, dogs, or anything that gets too close. Videos of people being chased by hissing geese might look funny online, but when you're on the receiving end, it's not so amusing. Managing them has proven tricky. Because they're now considered a naturalized species in many countries, there's debate over whether they should be culled or controlled. Some parks use egg oiling, coating eggs so they don't hatch, to keep populations stable, while others scare geese away with dogs, lasers, or even remote-controlled boats. But these birds are clever and persistent. And as long as there's easy food and water, they'll keep coming back. The irony is that many people enjoy seeing Canada geese, especially families with goslings waddling in a row, which makes population control a sensitive topic. But conservationists argue that without keeping numbers in check, native species like waders and ducks will keep losing habitat. So the next time you see a serene-looking flock of geese on a European lake, remember, behind the peaceful scene lies an army of grazers that can strip a wetland, foul the water, and chase you off your picnic blanket if you get too close.
Mute swans. Picture a calm lake on a summer morning. The mist is rising, ducks are quietly paddling around, and suddenly a majestic white swan glides into view. Elegant, graceful, picture-perfect. You'd think this is a peaceful scene, until that swan sees another bird nearby and goes full WWE mode. Wings flapping, hissing, charging straight at anything in its path. That's the reality of mute swans in North America. They look like fairy tale creatures, but they're actually one of the most aggressive, invasive birds around, and they're wreaking havoc on wetlands. Mute swans are native to Europe and Asia, and they were brought to North America in the 1800s and early 1900s to decorate parks and fancy estates. People loved their beauty. Swans were symbols of grace and romance, but a few escaped captivity, and that's when things got complicated. Unlike many native waterfowl, mute swans don't just eat a little pondweed and move on. They are eating machines, consuming up to 8 pounds of aquatic vegetation every day. Worse, they uproot plants while feeding, destroying much more vegetation than they actually eat. In shallow wetlands, this can leave muddy, barren bottoms where fish, amphibians, and invertebrates once thrived. And then there's their attitude. Mute swans are notoriously territorial, especially during nesting season. They don't just defend their own nests, they'll clear entire sections of a lake of anything that moves, from ducks and geese to muskrats, and even humans in kayaks. There are documented cases of swans capsizing small boats, and even attacking people who got too close. Native ducks, loons, and other water birds often abandon prime habitat rather than risk a fight. The population problem is big, too. Mute swans are long-lived, highly successful breeders, and their numbers in some parts of the U.S., like the Great Lakes region and Chesapeake Bay, have exploded over the last century. In certain areas, biologists have recorded population growth rates of over 10% a year, which means more and more wetlands are being taken over. Wildlife managers have tried controlling their numbers through egg addling, coating eggs so they don't hatch, and even culling adult swans. But these efforts are controversial.
People love swans. They're iconic, and nobody likes the idea of harming them, which makes management a public relations nightmare. But without control, native waterfowl lose habitat, plant communities collapse, and wetland biodiversity drops. It's one of those tough conservation dilemmas. Do you protect the pretty invader, or do you protect the ecosystem it's damaging? So the next time you see a pair of elegant white swans gliding across a lake, remember, underneath that graceful surface is a surprisingly destructive force, one that can turn a thriving wetland into a swan-only zone.
Sacred ibis. When you think of the sacred ibis, you probably imagine ancient Egypt, temples, hieroglyphs, and mummified birds buried as offerings to the gods. Fast forward a few thousand years, and this same species has become an unexpected troublemaker in France. Yes, France. Sacred ibises are striking birds, white with black heads and long, curved bills, and they were first brought to France in the 1970s and 80s for zoo exhibits and ornamental collections. They looked exotic and beautiful wandering around parks. But, as so often happens, some escaped or were deliberately released, and soon they were nesting in the wild. By the 1990s, they were breeding successfully in Brittany and the Atlantic coast, and their numbers began to grow fast. At first, people thought they were a charming addition to the French landscape. But then researchers started noticing something alarming. Colonies of native birds, especially terns, herons, and cormorants, were declining where ibises were present. Why? Because ibises are opportunistic feeders. They don't just eat insects and small crustaceans. They raid nests for eggs and chicks, cleaning out entire breeding colonies. In some protected nature reserves, scientists found that ibis predation caused massive drops in breeding success for native water birds. Species that were already struggling to maintain populations now had a new, clever predator targeting them at their most vulnerable moment. For colonial nesters like terns, where hundreds of pairs gather to raise chicks in the same spot, one ibis can do huge damage in a short time. And because ibises nest in large groups themselves, their populations can boom quickly. By the early 2000s, there were thousands of them in western France, and they were starting to spread inland. This raised big concerns for conservationists who worried about the impact on already fragile wetland ecosystems. France eventually decided to step in. Wildlife managers began control programs, including removing eggs, culling adult birds, and preventing new colonies from forming. These actions were controversial. After all, many people had grown to enjoy seeing these striking birds, but they were deemed necessary to protect native species. In some areas, numbers have since dropped significantly, giving tern and heron colonies a chance to recover. The story of the sacred ibis in France is a perfect example of how something that seems harmless, even beautiful, can disrupt an entire ecosystem when it's taken out of its natural context. In Africa, where they belong, sacred ibises are just one part of a balanced food web. In Europe, they became a top predator on vulnerable nesting birds. So next time you see a graceful white ibis wading through a French wetland, remember, It might look elegant, but it could also be the reason an entire colony of native birds is eerily quiet.
Java sparrows are considered a pacing outside the controlled environment, but within the range of contemplative relaxation. If you picture a sparrow, you probably think of a tiny, drab, brown bird. But the Java sparrow is no ordinary sparrow. It's bigger, flashier, with sleek gray feathers, a pink beak, and a sort of tuxedo look that makes it stand out. They're gorgeous little birds. But in Hawaii, they've turned into a problem that farmers and conservationists can't ignore. Java sparrows are native to Indonesia, where they've been kept as pets for centuries. In fact, they're so popular that they're considered a status symbol in some parts of Asia. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, they were brought to Hawaii for the pet trade, and, as often happens, some escaped or were released. With Hawaii's mild climate and abundant food, they didn't just survive, they thrived. Fast forward to today, and Java sparrows are now a common sight across the Hawaiian Islands, gathering in large, noisy flocks that can number in the hundreds. And here's where the trouble starts. They are seed specialists. These birds love grain, and that puts them in direct conflict with farmers. They raid rice fields, peck at corn crops, and feed on sorghum and millet, sometimes causing significant economic losses. But it's not just farms that take a hit. Hawaii has a unique set of native forest birds, many of which are endangered. These endemic finches, called honey creepers, rely on seeds, nectar, and insects, and Java sparrows compete with them for food and nesting sites. Because sparrows are generalists and breed quickly, they can outnumber and outcompete native species, pushing them closer to extinction. And there's another layer to the problem: disease. Java sparrows can carry avian diseases like poxvirus and malaria, which are devastating to Hawaii's native birds, many of which have little to no natural immunity. By acting as reservoirs for these pathogens, sparrows may be making it harder for native bird populations to recover. Controlling Java sparrows isn't simple. They're beloved by some locals and bird enthusiasts because of their beauty, and culling them is controversial. Plus, they reproduce quickly, several broods per year, so any population reduction efforts have to be constant and widespread to have an impact. Some researchers are focusing on habitat management instead, restoring native forests and planting vegetation that favors native birds over invasive ones. Others are studying how to better protect crops using netting or deterrents, so farmers lose less to the flocks. The story of the Java sparrow in Hawaii is a classic tale of unintended consequences. A beautiful bird brought in for pleasure, turning into a serious agricultural and ecological headache. So next time you see a flock of elegant gray birds chattering away on a telephone wire in Hawaii, Remember, those charming little seed-eaters are part of a quiet invasion that's changing both the farms and the forests of the islands.
Red-whiskered bulbul. At first glance, the red-whiskered bulbul looks like a charming little bird. It's small, perky, with a spiky crest and bright red cheek patches that give it a cheerful, almost cartoonish expression. Its song is pleasant, its personality curious, the kind of bird you'd think would be a delight to have around. But in places like Hawaii, California, and several tropical islands, this little bird has a big problem. It's unintentionally turning invasive plants into an unstoppable army. The red-whiskered bulbul is native to India and Southeast Asia, but humans have a habit of moving animals around the globe, and these birds were no exception. In the 1960s, they were introduced to Hawaii, some say as escaped pets, others say deliberately released by bird lovers. They found paradise there, a warm climate, lots of fruit, no major predators. Before long, their numbers exploded, especially on Oahu, where they're now one of the most common songbirds. Here's the twist. Bulbuls love fruit. They eat berries, figs, and small fruits from many plants, including invasive ones like Myconia, strawberry guava, and Clidamia. And here's where they become a problem. After eating, they fly off and, so to speak, plant those seeds all over the place in their droppings. Because bulbuls travel long distances, they spread invasive plant seeds farther and faster than most native birds. The result is a kind of ecological turbo boost for weeds. Plants like Myconia, nicknamed the green cancer of Hawaii, grow so aggressively that they smother native forests, causing landslides and crowding out rare Hawaiian species. Bulbuls are basically their delivery service, turning isolated weeds into island-wide invasions. And it's not just plants. Bulbuls also raid orchards and gardens, eating commercial fruit crops like lychees, papayas, and figs, which make them a headache for farmers. Their constant chatter and presence in urban areas can even annoy residents who find them noisy and aggressive toward other birds. Controlling bulbul populations is tricky. They're protected in some places as non-game birds, which makes culling controversial. Plus, they breed quickly, 2 or 3 clutches a year, so even if you remove a large number, their populations can rebound fast. Some researchers are exploring ways to restore native bird populations, since native frugivores don't spread invasive plants as efficiently. But that's a slow process. The red-whiskered bulbul is a perfect example of how even a small, pretty bird can completely shift an ecosystem just by doing what it does naturally, eating fruit and flying around. So next time you see a red-cheeked little bird hopping through a tree in Hawaii or California, remember that cute gardener might just be planting the next wave of invasive weeds that will take over the forest.
Cattle egrets. Imagine a herd of cows grazing in a sunny field. Around their feet, a small white bird struts confidently, snatching up bugs as the cows stir them up from the grass. It looks like a perfectly peaceful scene, like nature's little partnership. But zoom out, and you'll see that the cattle egret isn't just tagging along with livestock. This little hitchhiker has gone global, riding on the back of agriculture and in the process quietly reshaping ecosystems.
Cattle egrets are originally from Africa and parts of Asia. For most of their evolutionary history, they followed wild grazing animals like buffalo and antelope. But once humans started keeping large herds of cattle, sheep, and horses, cattle egrets hit the jackpot. Suddenly, they had a reliable, year-round source of insects, and they began spreading far beyond their original range. And when I say spreading, I mean they went everywhere. Unlike many invasive species that humans actively moved, cattle egrets did it mostly on their own. They flew across oceans, colonizing South America, North America, Australia, and Europe in just a few decades. Today, you can find them on nearly every continent except Antarctica. But here's where the problems start. Cattle egrets aren't picky. They eat insects, frogs, lizards, and even the occasional small mammal. That means they compete with native birds for food. In some regions, they've been blamed for reducing insect populations that other species rely on. They also gather in enormous flocks, sometimes thousands of birds, and those roosts produce huge amounts of droppings that can damage trees and spread disease. Speaking of disease, cattle egrets can carry and spread parasites and pathogens that affect both wildlife and livestock. For example, they can act as hosts for ticks and other blood-sucking pests, moving them from one herd to another. In some cases, they've been linked to outbreaks of livestock diseases, which makes farmers less fond of their presence. And while they're not usually aggressive toward other animals, their sheer numbers can push native birds out of prime feeding and nesting areas. In places where they nest in large colonies, they can strip vegetation bare, leaving behind a foul-smelling mess that alters the habitat for years. Managing cattle egrets is complicated because they're now so widespread and in some places even legally protected. Some control efforts focus on reducing roosting sites near sensitive wetlands or airports where large flocks can be a hazard to planes. But overall, they're considered here to stay, one of the most successful natural invaders in history. So next time you see a group of elegant white birds following cows through a field, remember, they're not just cleaning up pests. They're part of a global wave of change, following humanity's livestock wherever it goes and reshaping ecosystems in ways we're still trying to understand.
Brown tree snakes. Imagine walking through a tropical forest at dawn. Normally, you'd expect to hear a chorus of birdsong, chirps, whistles, calls echoing through the trees. But on the Pacific island of Guam, the forest is eerily silent. No birds, no rustle of wings, just quiet. The culprit? A single invader, the brown tree snake. This nightmare started sometime in the 1940s or 50s, when brown tree snakes accidentally hitched a ride to Guam, likely as stowaways on military cargo ships after World War II. Back home in Australia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, these snakes are just another predator in the food web. But Guam had no native snakes, and plenty of naive, ground-nesting birds that had never seen a snake before. The results were devastating. Brown tree snakes are nocturnal, excellent climbers, and highly opportunistic hunters. They slither through trees at night, raiding nests for eggs and chicks, and even preying on adult birds, lizards, and small mammals. Within just a few decades, they wiped out 10 of Guam's 12 native forest bird species.
The island's rails, kingfishers, and flycatchers, gone. Some species exist now only in zoos or on nearby snake-free islands. And when the birds disappeared, the entire ecosystem shifted. Birds are critical for pollinating plants and spreading seeds. Without them, some trees stopped regenerating. Insects that used to be eaten by birds started booming in population, changing the balance of the forest. Scientists call this a trophic cascade, when one predator alters the entire food web, and Guam became a textbook example. The snakes didn't stop at wildlife. They also began causing problems for humans. With so many snakes on the island, estimates range from up to 13,000 snakes per square mile in some areas. They started climbing power poles and causing electrical outages by shorting out transformers. Guam has had hundreds of power outages thanks to these uninvited serpents. Controlling brown tree snakes is one of the most challenging invasive species battles in the world. Traps, barriers, and snake-sniffing dogs are used around airports and shipping ports to prevent them from spreading to other islands like Hawaii. One of the most innovative methods? Airdropping dead mice laced with acetaminophen, yes, Tylenol, into the forest. A dose that's harmless to most other animals, but deadly to snakes. But eradication from Guam is nearly impossible at this point. The snakes are too widespread. The focus now is containment, keeping them from reaching other Pacific islands where they could wipe out more unique bird species. So the next time you hear an empty silence in a forest, think of Guam, an island where the songbirds were silenced by a single stowaway predator, proving how one species can change the entire soundscape of an ecosystem.
Cane toads. Picture this. It's 1935 in Queensland, Australia. Farmers are desperate because beetles are destroying their sugarcane crops. The solution? Import cane toads from South America to eat the beetles. Sounds like a clever biological fix, except it wasn't. What came next was one of the most infamous invasive species disasters in history. Here's the first twist. The cane toads never really solved the beetle problem. The beetles lived high up on the cane stalks, out of the toad's reach. But the toads thrived anyway. They found plenty of other insects to eat, bred like crazy, and started spreading far beyond the cane fields where they were introduced. Cane toads are hardy, prolific, and armed with a powerful defense. They secrete a potent toxin from glands on their shoulders. In South America, local predators know not to mess with them. But in Australia, everything from dingoes to goannas to crocodiles tried to eat these fat, slow-moving toads and died. The result was a mass poisoning event across the ecosystem. Populations of quolls, a native carnivorous marsupial, snakes, and freshwater crocodiles crashed in areas where the toads spread, and spread they did. Cane toads are now marching across northern Australia at a rate of about 30 to 60 kilometers per year. In fact, they've evolved to get better at invading. Toads on the front line of the invasion have longer legs and can cover more ground than earlier generations.
Scientists call them super invaders. The numbers are staggering. There are now hundreds of millions of cane toads in Australia. They eat almost anything that moves. Insects, frogs, even pet food left outside, and compete with native animals for resources. Their tadpoles are toxic too, which means native predators that try to eat them die, and native tadpoles are outcompeted. Attempts to control them have ranged from trapping to citizen toad-busting events where volunteers collect and humanely kill them by the thousands. But because they reproduce so quickly, females can lay up to 30,000 eggs at a time. Wiping them out completely is nearly impossible. Scientists are even exploring gene drive technology or diseases that could target only cane toads, but those solutions are still experimental. The tragedy of the cane toad invasion is that it's a classic case of good intentions gone horribly wrong. Farmers just wanted to save their crops. Instead, they triggered a continent-wide ecological chain reaction that's still unfolding almost a century later. So the next time you see one of those big, warty toads hopping along a road in northern Australia, remember, that's not just a frog on a walk. It's part of an unstoppable toxic wave that has changed the face of Australia's wildlife forever.
Burmese pythons. Imagine walking through the Florida Everglades at night. The air is heavy, the frogs are croaking, and somewhere in the sawgrass, a 15-foot-long predator is lying in wait. Not a native alligator, but a Burmese python. This is one of the biggest invasive species disasters in the United States, and it's completely transformed the Everglades. Burmese pythons are native to Southeast Asia, where they're part of a balanced ecosystem. But in Florida, they're apex predators with almost no natural enemies. How did they get there? Most likely through the exotic pet trade. People bought baby pythons as pets, but when they grew to 10, 12, even 18 feet long and became impossible to handle, some were released into the wild. Then Hurricane Andrew in 1992 destroyed breeding facilities, releasing even more. Once they established themselves, things got bad quickly. Pythons are ambush predators. They lie in wait and strike with lightning speed, coiling around their prey and squeezing until it suffocates. In their native range, they eat birds, rodents, even deer. And in Florida, they do the same. Except there's nothing to keep their population in check. Biologists studying the Everglades have reported catastrophic declines in small mammal populations since pythons became widespread. In some areas, raccoons are down by 99%, opossums by 98%, and marsh rabbits have virtually disappeared. Even bobcats and foxes have taken massive hits. And pythons aren't stopping at small animals. They've been documented eating full-grown deer, alligators, and in rare cases, household pets. The scale of the invasion is mind-blowing. No one knows exactly how many pythons are in the Everglades, but estimates range from tens of thousands to over 100,000. They're so hard to spot that for every one caught, dozens more may be out there breeding. Females can lay up to 100 eggs at a time, meaning the population can grow incredibly fast.
Florida has launched python hunts, with cash prizes for the longest and most pythons removed. Trained hunters, snake-sniffing dogs, and radio-tagged scout snakes, sterilized males used to lead researchers to females, are part of the effort. Still, eradication is considered impossible at this point. The goal is simply to limit their numbers so native wildlife has a fighting chance. The Burmese python invasion is more than just a creepy snake story. It's a lesson in how quickly an ecosystem can change when a top predator is introduced. The Everglades went from a place full of small mammals to a place where those animals are nearly gone, and the long-term effects on the entire food web are still unfolding. So the next time you hear about a record-breaking python being captured in Florida, know that it's not just a headline. It's part of an ongoing war to reclaim one of America's most unique ecosystems from a predator that doesn't belong there.
Red-eared slider turtles. You've probably seen them 100 times. Little green turtles with red stripes behind their eyes, sitting on logs in city ponds or basking on rocks in the sun. They look harmless, even cute. But these red-eared sliders have quietly become one of the most widespread invasive reptiles on the planet, and they're giving native turtles a run for their money. Red-eared sliders are native to the southern United States, but starting in the mid-20th century, they became one of the most popular pets in the world. Millions were sold, often as tiny hatchlings in plastic kits with a little palm tree. But here's the problem. Those hatchlings don't stay tiny. They can live 30-plus years, grow to the size of a dinner plate, and eventually become a lot to handle. So what happens when people don't want their pet turtle anymore? All too often, they release it into the nearest pond, lake, or river, thinking they're setting it free. And that's how red-eared sliders ended up on every continent except Antarctica. Once they're in the wild, these turtles are tough competitors. They eat just about anything: plants, insects, fish, amphibians, and they're aggressive baskers, physically pushing native turtles off prime sunny spots. Since turtles need sun to regulate their body temperature and stay healthy, losing those basking spots can put native species at a big disadvantage. They also breed prolifically. Female sliders lay multiple clutches of eggs each year, and in warm climates, those eggs have high survival rates. Before long, a few released pets can turn into a thriving, self-sustaining population. In Europe, Asia, and South America, red-eared sliders have become a common sight, often outnumbering local turtles entirely. The consequences go beyond just competition. In some places, red-eared sliders spread parasites and diseases to native turtles, adding even more pressure. And because they're generalist feeders, they can alter the balance of aquatic ecosystems by reducing amphibian populations or overgrazing aquatic plants. Efforts to control them vary by region. In parts of Europe and Asia, it's now illegal to sell or import red-eared sliders. Wildlife agencies sometimes organize trapping programs to remove them from sensitive habitats, but full eradication is difficult. They're hardy, shy, and live for decades. Education campaigns now warn against releasing pet turtles, encouraging owners to rehome them responsibly instead. This story is a reminder that even the smallest, most innocent-looking pets can have global consequences. What started as a cute desk ornament in someone's home turned into an international invader that's displacing native wildlife.
Tokay geckos. If you've ever spent a night in the tropics and suddenly heard a loud, almost barking call that sounds like someone yelling, "Tokay, Tokay," Congratulations! You've just met the Tokay gecko. These guys are one of the largest geckos in the world, brightly colored with blue-gray skin and orange spots, and they've become a surprising invader in the Caribbean, where they're quietly pushing native lizards to the sidelines. Tokay geckos are native to Southeast Asia, where they live in rainforests and villages, often right alongside humans. They're famous for their loud calls, powerful bite, and habit of lurking near lights at night to ambush insects. People all over the world keep them as pets, and some cultures even believe they bring good luck. But pet trade escapes and accidental introductions through shipping containers have allowed these geckos to establish themselves far outside their natural range. In the Caribbean, Tokay geckos have found paradise. Warm weather, plenty of insects, and lots of buildings to hide in. But their arrival has been bad news for the native lizard population. Tokays are big, much bigger than the small, delicate anoles and geckos that evolved on these islands, and that size gives them an advantage. They eat more, they can take larger prey, and they're not shy about competing for the same insect buffet that native species depend on. Worse still, Tokays are known to eat smaller lizards, including natives. They'll even take hatchlings of other geckos and anoles if they get the chance. Over time, this means native lizards start to decline in areas where Tokays become established. Fewer native lizards mean fewer pollinators and insect eaters, which can throw local ecosystems out of balance. Their presence can also create problems for people. Tokay geckos are nocturnal and very vocal, so when they colonize homes, hotels, or guest houses, their calls can keep people awake. And while they're not dangerous, they have a notoriously strong bite for their size and will latch on if handled. Controlling them is tough. Tokays are excellent climbers, can squeeze into tiny cracks, and are mostly active at night, which makes trapping them a challenge. Some islands have started monitoring programs to keep track of their spread, but full eradication is nearly impossible once they've established a population. The Tokay gecko invasion is one of those subtle ecological changes you might not notice at first, until one day you realize the familiar native lizards you used to see are gone, replaced by these bold, spotted giants. So, next time you hear that loud Tokay call echoing through a Caribbean night, remember, that sound is more than just a quirky tropical experience. It's the battle cry of an invader that's changing the island's ecosystem, one insect and one unlucky lizard at a time.
Coqui frogs. If you've ever spent a night in parts of Hawaii and wondered why it sounds like you're standing next to a stadium full of car alarms, you've probably heard the coqui frog. These tiny frogs, barely the size of a quarter, are famous for their loud, piercing coqui, coqui calls that can head up to 100 decibels. That's about as loud as a jackhammer. And they don't just call once or twice. They do it all night, every night. Coqui frogs are native to Puerto Rico, where their calls are beloved as part of the island's soundtrack. But in Hawaii, where they were accidentally introduced in the late 1980s, likely through shipments of plants, They've turned into one of the loudest invasive species problems on the planet, literally. At first, people thought they were cute. A few frogs calling at night didn't seem like a big deal. But coqui frogs breed explosively. A single female can lay over 1,000 eggs per year. And because Hawaii has no natural predators to keep them in check, their populations exploded. In some places, there are now tens of thousands of frogs per acre. And that's where the noise becomes unbearable. Entire neighborhoods have reported sleepless nights, with residents unable to block out the constant chorus, no matter how tightly they shut their windows. Property values in some areas have dropped, simply because people can't stand living near coqui infestations. But it's not just the noise that's the problem. It's what the frogs are eating. Coquis are voracious insectivores, and they've been devouring native insects that local birds and bats rely on for food. That throws off the entire food chain, potentially impacting pollination and other ecological processes. Hawaii's native insects are already under pressure from habitat loss and other invasive species. Adding millions of hungry frogs into the mix just makes it worse. Efforts to control them have ranged from spraying citric acid, a legal frog-killing method, to hand-capturing frogs at night. There have been even coqui hunts, where volunteers go out with headlamps and buckets to catch as many as possible. But the truth is, once coquis get established in an area, total eradication is almost impossible. This invasion has created one of the weirdest cultural divides in Hawaii. Some people hate the frogs for the noise. Others have learned to live with them. And a few even claim to enjoy the chorus. But scientists warn that if their range keeps expanding, Hawaii's unique insect populations and the birds that depend on them could face serious declines. So the next time you hear a loud coqui, coqui echoing through a Hawaiian night, remember, that's not just an exotic background sound. It's the call of an invader that's eating its way through the islands and keeping half the neighborhood awake while it does it. Cuban tree frogs are native to the Caribbean, but they arrived in Florida in the early 1900s, probably as stowaways on cargo ships. At first, they were just another exotic curiosity. But they quickly spread through the state, and today they're found almost everywhere in central and southern Florida, from wetlands and suburbs to golf courses and shopping centers. Here's why they're such a problem. Cuban tree frogs are voracious predators. They eat insects, sure, but they also eat other frogs and lizards, including Florida's native tree frogs, toads, and anoles. In fact, they'll even eat frogs of their own species if given the chance. This appetite puts intense pressure on native amphibian populations, which are already struggling due to habitat loss and disease. And speaking of disease, Cuban tree frogs are carriers of parasites like the rat lungworm, which can cause serious neurological illness in mammals, including humans, though cases are rare. They also carry chytrid fungus, which has been linked to worldwide declines in amphibians. By spreading these pathogens, Cuban tree frogs make it harder for native frogs to recover. On top of that, they're just everywhere. They breed in any body of water, roadside ditches, backyard ponds, even swimming pools if they get the chance. Females can lay thousands of eggs per season, and the tadpoles grow quickly, outcompeting native frog tadpoles for food. Even homeowners notice the impact. Cuban tree frogs like to hide in places like electrical boxes and plumbing vents, sometimes clogging pipes or shorting out equipment. Their skin secretes a sticky, irritating toxin that can cause burning or itching if handled with bare hands, making them unpleasant to deal with up close. Florida wildlife experts actively encourage people to remove Cuban tree frogs when they find them, something they don't often say about animals. The recommended method is humane capture and euthanasia, because the goal is to slow their spread and give native frogs a fighting chance. But despite efforts to control them, Cuban tree frogs are spreading northward as winters get warmer. Biologists worry they could eventually reach other southern states, bringing the same ecological problems with them. So the next time you see a pale, bug-eyed frog stuck to your window in Florida, remember it's not just a harmless visitor. It's part of a growing army of invaders, eating the locals, spreading parasites, and quietly reshaping the soundscape of Florida's nights.
Green iguanas. If you've ever been to South Florida and seen a big, scaly lizard lounging by the pool like it owns the place, you've met the green iguana. They look like miniature dinosaurs. They're great at posing for tourist photos, and they seem harmless as they bask in the sun. But here's the thing. In Florida, these sun-loving reptiles have gone from quirky curiosity to full-blown nuisance, causing millions of dollars in damage and threatening native wildlife. Green iguanas are native to Central and South America, where they're part of the natural ecosystem. But in Florida, they got here through the exotic pet trade, and thanks to escapes and deliberate releases, they've taken over. Florida's warm climate is perfect for them, so their populations have exploded, especially in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and the Keys. Here's where the problems start. Green iguanas are excellent burrowers. They dig long tunnels along canals, under sidewalks, and around seawalls, weakening the ground and causing collapses. In some areas, this has led to property damage that costs homeowners thousands to repair. They can even destabilize levees and other flood control structures, not a small problem in a state that already battles hurricanes and flooding. Then there's the ecological side. Iguanas are mostly herbivores, and they're not picky. They eat a wide range of plants, including endangered native species that play important roles in coastal ecosystems. They also raid gardens, strip ornamental plants, and munch through crops like lettuce and beans. In the Keys, they're known to eat the flowers of rare plants before they can seed, putting those species at risk of local extinction. Green iguanas can also cause headaches for infrastructure.
They climb into power substations and transformers, sometimes causing electrical outages. They poop everywhere. Their droppings can contaminate pools and spread salmonella. And when cold snaps hit, these reptiles literally fall out of trees because their bodies go into a cold-induced coma, startling residents and sometimes causing injuries when they land on cars or people. Florida wildlife agencies now classify green iguanas as invasive and encourage property owners to humanly remove them. There are professional iguana wranglers who trap or hunt them for a living, and in some places, residents have started cooking and eating them, nicknaming them chicken of the trees. But like many invasive species, eradication is unlikely. Green iguanas breed quickly. Females lay up to 70 eggs at a time, and they thrive anywhere there's a bit of sun and some greenery. The best hope is to keep their numbers manageable and prevent them from spreading farther north as winters get milder. So next time you see one of these big lizards soaking up rays on a canal bank, remember, they may look like chill little dragons, but under those scales, they're busy undermining your seawall, stripping your garden, and quietly changing Florida's landscape one burrow at a time.
Nile monitors. Imagine walking your dog near a Florida canal and seeing what looks like a small crocodile slither out of the water. Long body, forked tongue, sharp claws, only to realize it's not a gator at all. It's a Nile monitor, one of the most intimidating lizards in the world. And yes, they are now living wild in parts of the United States. Nile monitors are native to sub-Saharan Africa, where they grow up to 7 feet long and are considered top reptilian predators. They were brought to the U.S. through the exotic pet trade because, let's be honest, people love keeping impressive, prehistoric-looking pets. But just like Burmese pythons, these lizards can get too big and too aggressive for most owners to handle. Many were released or escaped, and now there are breeding populations, especially in southwest Florida, near Cape Coral and along canals and wetlands. Here's the problem. Nile monitors are voracious hunters. They eat almost anything they can overpower. Birds, eggs, frogs, fish, and small mammals. They're especially devastating to turtles, digging up nests and eating the eggs of native and endangered species, including sea turtles and burrowing gopher tortoises. On some islands, monitors have been seen raiding entire colonies of ground-nesting birds, swallowing eggs and chicks whole. And it's not just wildlife at risk. These lizards have been known to prey on chickens, ducks, and even small pets if they get the chance. They're fast, strong, and excellent swimmers, so escaping from them isn't always easy. Controlling Nile monitors is a serious challenge. They're intelligent, wary of traps, and can cover large territories. Wildlife officials have tried tracking and removing them, but once an invasive predator like this gets established, complete eradication becomes nearly impossible. Their ability to hide in canals, storm drains, and thick vegetation makes them hard to find, and they reproduce quickly. Females can lay up to 60 eggs per year. There's also the public safety angle. While Nile monitors generally avoid humans, they can defend themselves fiercely if cornered, delivering painful bites, scratches, and even using their muscular tails as whips. Florida Fish and Wildlife warns people not to approach them,
but instead report sightings so removal teams can respond. The worry among ecologists is that if Nile monitors spread beyond their current range, they could devastate native species, just like pythons have in the Everglades. They're essentially filling a predator niche that Florida's ecosystems aren't prepared for. So next time you see a large lizard summing itself near a canal in Florida, take a closer look. It might not be an iguana. It might be a Nile monitor, a stealthy invader from Africa, reshaping the food chain, one egg, one chick, and maybe even one unlucky backyard pet at a time.
Asian house geckos. Picture a warm Australian night. You flick on your porch light, and within minutes, little lizards start appearing, clinging to the walls and ceiling, waiting for insects to gather. If you listen closely, you might hear a sharp chirping call, almost like a squeaky toy. That's the Asian house gecko, a small invader that's become a familiar nighttime companion in many Aussie suburbs. Asian house geckos are originally from Southeast Asia, but they probably arrived in northern Australia by hitchhiking on shipping cargo. Their first big populations showed up in Darwin and Queensland in the 1980s and 90s, and since then they've spread like wildfire through towns and cities. People actually like them at first. They keep insect numbers down and are kind of cute. But here's the twist. They're quietly pushing native geckos out. Australia has its own geckos, many of them small and secretive, that used to dominate the urban night scene. But Asian house geckos are more aggressive, more tolerant of light, and faster breeders. They literally take over the prime spots near outdoor lights where insects gather, leaving native geckos with fewer opportunities to feed. And it's not just competition. These geckos actually change the nocturnal insect web. That delicate balance of what insects come out at night, when and how many survive until morning. Because they're so numerous and efficient at catching prey, they can drastically reduce the number of moths, beetles, and other insects in an area, which can ripple through the ecosystem. Less food for spiders, frogs, and native lizards means their populations can start to shrink too. They're also loud, unusually loud for a gecko. Their chirping calls, used for communication and territory defense, can get annoying if you have a lot of them around. Some homeowners complain about being kept awake at night by gecko calls echoing through their houses. Asian house geckos also carry parasites and diseases that native geckos aren't used to, which could pose another threat. Scientists are still studying exactly how much impact these parasites have on native reptile populations, but it's yet another advantage for the invader. Eradicating them is next to impossible at this point. They're everywhere, from cities to small country towns, and they reproduce quickly. The best we can do is monitor their spread and keep an eye on what they're doing to native species and insect populations. So the next time you see a little pale gecko darting across your wall at night, chirping loudly as it gulps down a moth, remember, it's not just a harmless bug eater. It's part of a continent-wide takeover, slowly rewriting the nightlife of Australian suburbs one light bulb at a time.
Lionfish. Imagine snorkeling on a coral reef in the Caribbean. The water is clear, colorful fish are darting everywhere, and suddenly you spot a lionfish, a stunning creature with red and white stripes and long feathery spines that look like a living piece of art. Beautiful, right? Unfortunately, in the Atlantic, that beauty hides a big problem. The lionfish has become one of the most destructive reef invaders in history. Lionfish are native to the Indo-Pacific, where they fit neatly into the food web, with predators that keep their numbers in check. But sometime in the 1980s, a few lionfish either escaped or were released from home aquariums in Florida. With no natural enemies in the Atlantic and a perfect warm water environment, they multiplied, and multiplied fast. The problem with lionfish is that they're voracious hunters. They eat anything small enough to fit in their mouths. Juvenile reef fish, shrimp, crabs, even baby groupers and snappers that are vital to healthy fisheries. Studies have shown that lionfish can reduce native reef fish populations by up to 80% in just a few years. That's not just a little imbalance, that's a full-on collapse of the reef community. And they have another superpower. They eat constantly. A single lionfish can consume over 50 prey items in a single day. And they hunt using a unique ambush strategy, spreading their spines like a net to corner prey before striking lightning fast. Worse, they reproduce like crazy. A single female can release up to 30,000 eggs every few days, year-round. This means that even if a large number are removed, the population can bounce back frighteningly quickly. Divers, fishermen, and scientists have launched a massive effort to control them. Lionfish derbies, competitive spearfishing events, have become popular, with cash prizes for the biggest haul. There's even a growing market for lionfish as food, since their white, flaky meat is delicious and safe to eat once the venomous spines are removed. But eradication is nearly impossible at this point. Lionfish are found from North Carolina all the way down to Brazil and even in the Mediterranean. They live at depths too great for most divers to reach, which means huge parts of the population are completely untouched. The danger isn't just to fish, it's to entire coral reef ecosystems. Reef fish are the cleaners, grazers, and gardeners of the reef, keeping algae in check and maintaining the balance that allows coral to thrive. Remove too many, and reefs become overgrown, sickly, and eventually die. So next time you see a photo of a lionfish, remember that gorgeous frilly predator might be one of the biggest threats to the Atlantic's reefs. It's a beautiful invader, but it's eating the ocean alive, one bite at a time.
Asian carp. Picture yourself cruising down the Mississippi River on a sunny afternoon. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a 30-pound fish launches out of the water, smacks into the side of your boat, and nearly knocks you over. Sounds like a weird fishing story, right? But this is the reality of the Asian carp invasion, a crisis that's been turning parts of America's greatest river system into something out of a bizarre nature documentary. Asian carp isn't just one fish. It's actually several species, including bighead carp, silver carp, and grass carp.
They were brought to the U.S. in the 1970s to help clean algae from catfish ponds and wastewater treatment facilities. But during floods, they escaped into the wild and found their way into the Mississippi River system. Once they got in, they didn't just survive, they thrived. These fish are filter feeders, straining plankton out of the water, which might sound harmless until you realize that plankton is the base of the food chain. By vacuuming up so much of it, Asian carp outcompete native species like paddlefish, buffalo fish, and young sport fish like bass that also rely on plankton. This means fewer native fish growing up to adulthood, which disrupts the entire aquatic ecosystem. And then there's their most notorious behavior, the leaping. Silver carp, in particular, are known for their habit of jumping out of the water when startled by boat engines. We're not talking about little hops either. These fish can leap up to 10 feet in the air, and when you have dozens of them jumping at once, it's chaos. People have been injured, broken noses, concussions, even knocked off boats by these flying fish. The numbers are staggering. In some stretches of the Mississippi and its tributaries, Asian carp now make up over 90% of the total fish biomass. That means 9 out of 10 fish in the river are carp. It's hard to overstate how much that changes the ecosystem. Controlling them has become a major, expensive effort. The Army Corps of Engineers has installed electric barriers in waterways near Chicago to keep them from reaching the Great Lakes, where they could devastate multi-billion-dollar fisheries. There are also commercial fishing programs encouraging harvest, not just for food, but to make fertilizer, pet food, and even fish patties for export. But the fight isn't over. Asian carp reproduce quickly, and they're excellent at colonizing new areas. One female can lay hundreds of thousands of eggs in a single season, meaning any gap in control efforts could lead to another explosion. So next time you see a video of someone being smacked in the face by a fish on a river, remember, that's not just a funny internet clip. It's a sign of one of the most serious freshwater invasions in North America playing out in real time.
Walking catfish. Imagine this. It's a rainy Florida evening. You're driving home and glance at the roadside ditch and see a bunch of fish wriggling their way across the grass, heading toward a pond on the other side of the road. It sounds like a scene from a weird sci-fi movie, but this is totally real. Meet the walking catfish, one of Florida's strangest and most persistent invaders. Walking catfish are native to Southeast Asia, where they evolved a superpower: the ability to breathe air and move across land using their pectoral fins. They don't walk gracefully. It's more of a wiggling, slithery crawl, but it works. When their ponds dry up or they smell food in a nearby water source, they simply get up and go. They were first introduced to Florida in the 1960s, likely through the aquarium trade and aquaculture escapes. At first, they were just a curiosity, a weird fish that could travel over lawns and parking lots after heavy rains. But once they established themselves, they started causing real problems for native fish and aquaculture farms. Walking catfish are opportunistic omnivores. They eat insects, crustaceans, small fish, and fish eggs. In new ponds, they can quickly dominate, reducing native fish populations by eating both their food and their young. They're also highly tolerant of low oxygen water, which allows them to survive in places where other fish can't. This means they can take over ditches, canals, and stormwater ponds, leaving native species with fewer places to live. Florida fish farmers were hit especially hard in the early years of the invasion. Walking catfish could crawl out of canals, across fields, and into fish ponds, where they'd feast on stocked fish, costing farmers thousands of dollars. There were even reports of catfish raids where entire ponds were nearly emptied overnight. Efforts to control them include installing fences and screens to keep them out of ponds and canals, as well as educating people not to release aquarium fish. But eradication is impossible at this point. Walking catfish are now a permanent part of Florida's freshwater systems. And here's the creepy part. They're most active on rainy nights, meaning you can actually see them walking across roads and yards during storm season. For some Floridians, it's a weirdly normal sight now, just another invasive species marching across the state, one puddle at a time. Walking catfish might not be as big or dramatic as pythons or iguanas, but they're a perfect example of how even a small wriggling invader can completely change an ecosystem. So the next time you see something moving in the grass on a wet Florida night, look twice. It might not be a snake. It could be a fish on its way to conquer the next pond.
Round goby. Imagine diving to the bottom of a Great Lakes riverbed. The water is murky, rocks are scattered across the floor, and everywhere you look, you see little fish staring back at you from the cracks. These are round gobies. And in just a few decades, they've gone from unknown outsiders to one of the most dominant fish in the entire Great Lakes system. Round gobies are native to the Black and Caspian Seas, but they hitched a ride to North America in the ballast water of cargo ships. When ships from Europe dumped that water into the Great Lakes in the 1990s, out came the gobies, and they loved what they found. Plenty of rocky habitat, lots of food, and not many predators that knew how to deal with them. Gobies are small, usually just a few inches long, but they're incredibly aggressive and territorial. They outcompete native bottom-dwelling fish like sculpins and log perch for both food and nesting spots. And here's the kicker. They eat fish eggs, including those of prized sport fish like smallmouth bass, walleye, and lake trout. That means fewer baby fish growing up to keep the ecosystem and the fishing industry healthy. But that's not all. Round gobies are also vectors for parasites, like the deadly avian botulism toxin, which works its way up the food chain and has killed thousands of water birds around the Great Lakes. They can also carry other pathogens that spread to native fish populations, adding another layer of stress to species already under pressure. Their population growth has been staggering. In some areas, scientists have counted goby densities of over 100 fish per square meter on the lake bottom. That's like turning the entire floor of the lake into a living carpet of gobies. Ironically, their invasion has had some mixed side effects. Round gobies are now a major food source for predators like smallmouth bass and even some water snakes, which have actually benefited from having so many easy meals around. But that doesn't erase the damage they're doing to biodiversity. The Great Lakes now have fewer native benthic, bottom-dwelling fish, and the entire structure of the food web has shifted. Controlling gobies is nearly impossible. They breed multiple times a season, lay thousands of eggs, and the males aggressively guard those eggs until they hatch, giving them a survival advantage over other fish. Managers have tried targeted trapping and chemical treatments, but at this point, the goal is more about managing their impact than eradicating them. The round goby story is a reminder that sometimes the biggest invaders aren't the ones you can see leaping out of the water. They're the quiet, unseen fish at the bottom, slowly rewriting the rules of the ecosystem from below. So, next time you go fishing in the Great Lakes and catch a small, puffy-headed fish that won't stop biting your bait, you might just have met one of the most successful invaders in North American waters.
Common carp worldwide. Picture a quiet pond on a summer morning. The water is clear. Plants sway gently below the surface. Dragonflies skim across the top. It's a little paradise. Now toss in a few common carp and come back a year later. The water is murky, the plants are gone, and the pond feels dead. This is the story of how one of the most widespread fish in the world has been quietly wrecking freshwater ecosystems for centuries. Common carp are native to Europe and Asia and have been around for thousands of years. In fact, they were one of the first fish ever farmed by humans, prized as a food source by the Romans, and bred in ponds across medieval Europe. They were later introduced to North America, Australia, and other parts of the world, often on purpose, as a cheap and easy source of protein. But here's the problem. Common carp have a very destructive feeding style. They're bottom feeders that root around in the mud, using their barbels, or whisker-like feelers, to find food. In the process, they stir up sediment, releasing nutrients into the water and making it cloudy. This murkiness blocks sunlight from reaching aquatic plants, which then die off. Without those plants to stabilize the sediment, the water stays muddy, and algae can take over, turning the whole lake green and slimy. Carp also physically uproot plants while foraging, which means there's less habitat for fish, frogs, and invertebrates. Waterfowl lose nesting areas. Entire food webs shift from clear-water, plant-rich systems to algae-dominated ones. It's like turning a lush underwater garden into a mud pit. And they're prolific breeders. A single female carp can produce hundreds of thousands of eggs per year. And because they can tolerate poor water quality, they often thrive in places where native fish struggle. This means they can dominate lakes and rivers once they get established. Around the world, people have tried all sorts of strategies to control them. In some places, commercial fishing operations remove tons of carp each year. In others, scientists experiment with water level manipulation, or drying out wetlands to kill carp eggs, or even targeted poisons that affect only carp. But because they reproduce so quickly and can move between connected waterways, completely eradicating them is next to impossible. Interestingly, there's a growing culinary movement encouraging people to eat common carp, rebranding it as a sustainable protein source. Properly prepared, carp can be tasty, and eating them could help keep populations under control. A story of the common carp is a reminder that not all invasive species are flashy or scary. Sometimes they're just muddy. But that mud hides a huge ecological cost, as these fish quietly transform beautiful plant-filled lakes into turbid, algae-choked water bodies. So the next time you see a big golden fish leap out of a lake, remember, that splash is more than just a ripple. It's part of an ongoing underwater revolution that's turning clear waters into murky battlegrounds.
Zander. Picture a quiet English river full of roach, bream, and perch lazily swimming through the current. Then along comes a sleek, sharp-toothed predator, half pike, half perch, that starts picking them off one by one. This is the zander, also called the pike perch, and while it's native to continental Europe, its presence in UK rivers has caused one of the most heated fishery debates in the country. The zander was first introduced to parts of the UK in the 1960s, mainly for sport fishing. Anglers were fascinated by this new species, big, hard-fighting, and delicious to eat. Some were legally stocked in reservoirs like the Great Ooze Relief Channel, but others were spread illegally by people moving fish between waters. Before long, zander populations began to take hold across rivers and canals in the Midlands and beyond. Here's where the controversy starts. Zander are top predators. They eat small fish, lots of them, and because they're efficient hunters, they can drastically reduce populations of native species like roach, gudgeon, and rudd. In some waters, anglers have reported dramatic declines in the variety and number of coarse fish after zander became established. This predatory pressure has ripple effects. When small fish populations crash, it changes the entire food web, affecting everything from insect populations to larger predators like pike that rely on those fish as prey. It can also make fishing less enjoyable for those targeting traditional coarse species, which is why many angling clubs consider zander a pest. But here's the twist. Not everyone hates them. Some anglers love catching zander, and in some fisheries they've become a popular sport species, drawing people from far and wide. This has created a big debate over whether they should be eradicated or managed as part of the ecosystem. Control measures have included culling. In some places, anglers are required to kill any zander they catch, and netting programs to remove them from certain rivers. But once zander establishes a breeding population, wiping them out completely is nearly impossible. They spawn successfully in turbid, slow-moving waters, and their fry are well protected by their parents, giving them a high survival rate compared to many native fish. The result is a classic invasive species dilemma. Do you try to fight them endlessly, or accept that they're now part of the ecosystem and focus on managing their numbers instead of eradicating them? The story of the zander in the UK is a reminder that sometimes we create new apex predators without fully thinking through the consequences. So the next time you hear an angler bragging about landing a monster Xander, remember that trophy fish might also be the reason the river feels quieter, with fewer shoals of silvery native fish flashing in the current.
Koi. Picture a city park pond on a sunny afternoon. Families are feeding ducks, kids are tossing bread into the water, and just below the surface swim brightly colored koi, orange, white, gold, and speckled like living jewels. They look peaceful and elegant, gliding in lazy circles. But beneath that serene surface, koi are busy turning your pretty park pond into a muddy, plantless mess. Koi are actually just fancy, domesticated versions of common carp, bred in Japan for their beautiful colors. People love them. They symbolize luck, prosperity, and peace, which is why they're kept in ornamental ponds all over the world. The problem is, koi don't always stay where they're supposed to. Sometimes they escape during floods. Sometimes they're dumped by well-meaning owners who don't want to keep them anymore. And sometimes people release them deliberately, thinking they're adding beauty to public lakes. But koi have the same bad habits as their wild cousins. They are bottom feeders that root through sediment looking for food. When they do this, they rip up aquatic plants and stir mud into the water column. Over time, a clear pond becomes cloudy and brown, and sunlight can't penetrate to the bottom. That means plants die off, fish lose spawning habitat, and algae often take over, leaving behind a smelly greenish soup that's a far cry from the picturesque lake visitors expect. Koi also reproduce quickly. A handful of released fish can turn into hundreds within a few years, and because they're hardy and tolerant of low-oxygen water, they often outcompete native fish species that can't handle degraded conditions. In some urban lakes, koi now make up the majority of the biomass, which means almost all the energy in that ecosystem is locked up in big plank-churning carp instead of being spread across a diverse mix of species. The impact isn't just ecological, it's expensive. Cities often spend millions dredging or aerating ponds, or even draining and restocking them entirely, just to get rid of koi and restore water quality. In some cases, they've had to use rotenone, a fish poison, to wipe out entire populations before reintroducing native species. There's also a public awareness issue. Many people think they're helping when they release koi into a lake, or they enjoy feeding them and watching them grow. But every bread toss just fuels the problem, because koi get bigger, breed faster, and stir up even more sediment. So the next time you see those colorful fish swimming in an urban lake, don't be fooled by their beauty. They might look like symbols of serenity, but underneath, they're busy turning that lake into a mud pit and pushing native species out.
Snakeheads. Imagine you're fishing on a quiet pond in Maryland or Virginia. The water is still, dragonflies buzz around, and then you catch sight of a strange, long, snake-like fish lurking just below the surface. It has sharp teeth, a big mouth, and if left alone, it might just crawl out of that pond and head for the next one. This is the northern snakehead, one of the most notorious invasive fish in the United States. Snakeheads are native to Asia and parts of Africa,
where they've been fished and eaten for centuries. But in the early 2000s, they started showing up in American ponds, canals, and rivers, probably due to releases from the live food trade or aquarium hobbyists who didn't want to keep such a large, aggressive fish. What makes snakeheads so scary is their list of superpowers. First, they're air breathers. They have a special organ that lets them gulp air and survive out of water for several hours. That means they can literally wriggle across wet ground to find a new pond when their old one dries up. Second, they're top-tier predators. They eat everything: fish, frogs, insects, even small birds or mammals if they can grab them. In a closed system like a pond, they can wipe out nearly all other fish species. When snakeheads were first discovered in Maryland in 2002, it sparked a media frenzy. They were nicknamed Frankenfish and even inspired horror movies because of their creepy, almost alien look. State wildlife agencies took it seriously, draining ponds, poisoning waterways, and urging the public to report and kill any snakehead caught. But despite those efforts, snakeheads have spread. Today, they're established in the Potomac River, Chesapeake Bay tributaries, and parts of the Midwest and Southeast. They're thriving, too. In some areas, anglers report catching dozens in a single day, with fish over 3 feet long not uncommon. Their presence has shifted ecosystems. Native fish populations, including bass and sunfish, often decline where snakeheads become established, because snakeheads not only eat them, but also compete for the same food sources. Their ability to reproduce rapidly, a single female can lay tens of thousands of eggs several times a year, makes them hard to control once they get a foothold. The good news is that snakeheads are edible and surprisingly delicious. Some wildlife agencies are now encouraging anglers to target them, turning them from an ecological nightmare into a potential food source. Still, full eradication is nearly impossible at this point. So the next time you see a headline about a walking fish discovered in someone's backyard, remember, it's not science fiction. It's the northern snakehead, an apex predator from halfway around the world that's busy turning parts of America's freshwater systems into its personal hunting grounds.
Tilapia. Picture a warm, shallow lake somewhere in Africa or Southeast Asia. The water ripples as a school of fish stirs up the mud. They're tilapia, and they're everywhere. For some communities, this is good news. Tilapia are a cheap, reliable source of protein. But for the ecosystem, and for many native fish species, these invaders have turned the lake into a battlefield. Tilapia are originally from parts of Africa and the Middle East, but humans have moved them around the world for decades because they grow quickly, tolerate poor water quality, and are easy to farm. That's why they're one of the most farmed fish on the planet. But once tilapia escape from fish farms, and they often do, they establish wild populations that can completely transform a lake or river. Here's why they're such game changers. Tilapia are highly competitive omnivores. They eat algae, plants, insects, and sometimes even the eggs and young of other fish. They breed constantly. Some species reproduce every few weeks. and the parents guard their young, giving them a survival advantage over many native fish. This means tilapia populations explode quickly, crowding out slower breeding native species. But it's not just about competition. Tilapia are expert diggers. They build nests by scooping out depressions in the sediment, which stirs up the bottom and releases nutrients into the water. This can cause algae blooms that make the water murky and lower oxygen levels, making it even harder for sensitive native fish to survive. Some lakes that were once clear and full of diverse fish species have been transformed into tilapia-dominated systems, with little left but a few hardy species that can tolerate the new murky conditions. In East Africa, tilapia introductions have been linked to declines in native cichlids, some of which are found nowhere else on Earth. Entire fisheries that once supported dozens of species now rely on just one, tilapia. There is an economic angle too. While tilapia can provide food security, they can also crash traditional fishing economies that relied on a variety of native species. Once tilapia dominate, fishers often have no choice but to catch and sell them, even if they were never considered valuable before. Controlling wild tilapia populations is tough. Draining lakes, targeted netting, and encouraging harvest can help reduce numbers, but eradication is usually impossible once they're established. Some projects focus on improving aquaculture practices so fewer fish escape into the wild in the first place. The story of tilapia is a tricky one because it's not just about an invader destroying ecosystems, it's also about an invader feeding millions of people. So the next time you see tilapia on a restaurant menu, remember, that fillet represents a fish that's so good at surviving and reproducing that it's taken over waters across 2 continents, changing the chemistry, the clarity, and the very future of the lakes it calls home.
Rough. Picture a trawler dragging its nets through Lake Superior. When the nets come up, they're full of fish, but instead of the valuable yellow perch the fishers were hoping for, they're wriggling with hundreds of small, spiny-backed fish called ruff. They might only be a few inches long, but these little invaders have become one of the Great Lakes' most aggressive success stories. Ruff, pronounced rough, are native to Europe and Asia. Like many Great Lakes invaders, they most likely arrived in the ballast water of cargo ships from overseas in the 1980s. When those ships dumped their water, they dumped ruff too, and the fish found the perfect environment waiting for them. Ruff are benthic fish, meaning they live on the bottom of lakes and rivers, and they reproduce fast. Females can lay tens of thousands of eggs each season, and the eggs hatch quickly, giving ruff an edge over slower breeding native species. Within a few years of their arrival, ruff populations in some parts of Lake Superior exploded, making up over 90% of the bottom-dwelling fish community in certain areas.
The problem isn't just their numbers, it's what they're displacing. Rough compete with native species like yellow perch, walleye, and other bottom-dwelling fish for food and habitat. Because rough are more aggressive feeders, they often outcompete natives, leading to declines in important sport and commercial fish populations. They also have a secret weapon, sharp spines on their dorsal fins. These spines make them less appealing to predators like larger fish, which means once they take over, there's not much to keep their population in check. Even if a predator does try to eat them, those spines can make swallowing them a painful experience. Rough are also remarkably adaptable. They can live in a wide range of water conditions, clear or murky, warm or cold, which means they can spread easily through connected waterways. Today, they're found not just in Lake Superior, but throughout much of the Great Lakes and into connected rivers. Efforts to control rough have included developing special fish poisons called pesticides that target them without harming other species, as well as encouraging commercial harvest. But because they're small and breed quickly, complete eradication isn't realistic. The focus now is on keeping them from spreading farther and managing their impact on native fish populations. The story of the rough is a reminder that you don't have to be big to cause big trouble. Sometimes it's the smallest, most overlooked species that reshape entire ecosystems. So next time you hear about invasive species in the Great Lakes, remember, it's not just the big, scary fish like carp and gobies. It's also these spiny little invaders, quietly taking over the bottom of the food chain and pushing out the fish that people have relied on for generations.
Emerald ash borer. Picture walking through a forest lined with tall, graceful ash trees. Their leaves make a perfect green canopy in summer, and their wood is prized for making baseball bats, tool handles, and furniture. Now imagine that forest a few years later. The trees are gray, bare and dead, standing like silent ghosts. This is the work of the emerald ash borer, one of the most destructive forest pests ever to hit North America. The emerald ash borer, also known as the EAB, is a small metallic green beetle native to Asia. It looks beautiful, like a living jewel, but its larvae are killers. They were first detected near Detroit, Michigan in 2002, probably brought over accidentally in wooden shipping pallets or packing material. By the time anyone noticed, the beetles had already been quietly spreading through nearby ash trees. Here's how they kill. Adult beetles lay eggs on the bark of ash trees. When the eggs hatch, the larvae tunnel into the tree and start feeding on the inner bark, the layer that transports water and nutrients. Over time, these feeding tunnels girdled the tree, cutting off its lifelines. Within 3 to 5 years, the tree is dead. The scale of destruction has been staggering. Since their arrival,
emerald ash borers have killed hundreds of millions of ash trees across at least 30 U.S. states and multiple Canadian provinces. In some areas, entire forests of ash have been wiped out. Cities have lost street trees by the thousands, costing millions in removal and replacement. And it's not just about losing pretty trees. Ash trees are a key part of many ecosystems, providing habitat for birds, insects, and mammals, and stabilizing soil near rivers and wetlands. Their loss changes the structure of forests, opening the canopy, letting in more sunlight, and allowing invasive plants to take over. The economic cost is massive, too. Municipalities spend billions in removing dead trees before they fall and damage power lines, houses, or roads. The loss of ash lumber also hits industries that rely on the wood for flooring, furniture, and sports equipment. Fighting back hasn't been easy. Quarantines were established to slow the movement of infested wood, but the beetles spread anyway, often hidden in firewood transported by campers. Biological control efforts are underunderway, including introducing tiny parasitic wasps from Asia that prey on emerald ash borer larvae. Some cities are also injecting valuable ash trees with insecticides to protect them, but this is expensive and needs to be repeated regularly. The emerald ash borer is a reminder that some of the deadliest invaders are the smallest and quietest. You don't hear them coming. You just wake up one day and your forest is gone. So, the next time you see a shimmering green beetle on a tree trunk, remember, that little sparkle might just be the beginning of the end for the ash trees in that forest.
Red imported fire ants. Picture stepping onto your lawn on a warm summer day. You notice a mound of soil that wasn't there yesterday. Before you realize what it is, the ground seems to come alive, and suddenly your legs are on fire. You've just stepped on a nest of red imported fire ants, one of the most aggressive, invasive insects in the world. Red imported fire ants are native to South America, but they arrived in the United States in the 1930s, likely as stowaways in soil or cargo shipped through the port of Mobile, Alabama. From there, they spread rapidly across the Southeast, thriving in warm, open areas like fields, lawns, and pastures. Today, they infest more than 300 million acres across the southern U.S., and they're slowly marching west and north. Fire ants are infamous for their painful sting. When their mound is disturbed, hundreds of ants swarm up anything nearby, including you, and sting in unison, injecting venom that burns and itches intensely. For most people, it's just a very unpleasant experience. But for some, the stings can trigger severe allergic reactions that require medical treatment. But their impact goes far beyond humans. Fire ants are aggressive predators and scavengers, and they attack newborn animals like ground-nesting birds, rabbits, and even livestock. There are reports of fire ants swarming the eyes and noses of newborn calves, blinding or killing them before farmers can intervene. They also attack turtles, lizards, and other wildlife, reducing populations of native species that never evolved to deal with such a ferocious insect.
On the agricultural side, fire ants damage crops by chewing through seeds, girdling young plants, and protecting crop pests like aphids in exchange for their sugary secretions. This creates a double hit for farmers: reduced yields and more pest outbreaks. And they're tough to get rid of. Their colonies can contain hundreds of thousands of ants and multiple queens, which means that if you only kill part of a colony, the survivors can quickly rebuild. They're also smart enough to move their nests after heavy rains or chemical treatments, sometimes building new mounds just a few feet away. The economic impact is staggering, billions of dollars each year in damage, control costs, and medical expenses. Entire industries have sprung up around fire ant control, from baits and pesticides to biological controls like parasitic phorid flies that attack the ants by laying eggs inside them. But complete eradication? Almost impossible. Fire ants are here to stay in much of their introduced range, and as the climate warms, they're expected to expand farther north. So the next time you see a suspicious mound in a sunny patch of soil, step carefully. Beneath that mound is an army, ready to attack anything that disturbs it, from insects to livestock to unlucky humans who make the mistake of getting too close.
Asian giant hornets. Imagine opening a beehive and finding nothing but decapitated bees and a few giant hornets crawling among the carnage. That's not a horror movie scene. That's the calling card of the Asian giant hornet, one of the most fearsome insect invaders ever to show up in North America. Asian giant hornets are native to Japan and other parts of Asia, where they're a natural part of the ecosystem. But in 2019, the first confirmed sightings occurred in Washington State and British Columbia, sparking a wave of alarm and the nickname murder hornet in the media. And it's not hard to see why. These hornets are the world's largest, growing up to 2 inches long, with a wingspan as wide as your thumb. They have powerful mandibles that can decapitate honeybees in seconds, and a single hornet can kill dozens of bees in just minutes. Here's why that's such a problem. North America's honeybee populations are already under pressure from disease, pesticides, and habitat loss. Asian giant hornets can wipe out entire hives in what scientists call a slaughter phase, a coordinated attack where a few hornets systematically kill every bee in the colony, then carry the larvae and pupae back to their own nest to feed their young. One small group of hornets can destroy a hive of thousands of bees in just a few hours. That's not just bad news for beekeepers. It's bad news for agriculture. Honeybees pollinate a huge portion of the crops we eat, from apples and blueberries to almonds. Losing more bees could ripple through the food supply. Luckily, the invasion was caught early. Washington State launched an all-out hunt to find and eradicate hornet nests before they could spread. Using traps, radio-tagged hornets, and even thermal imaging, they drilled out nests hidden underground and carefully vacuumed out the hornets. By late 2021, several nests had been destroyed, and no new confirmed sightings were reported for much of 2022-2023. But scientists warn that the threat isn't gone completely. It only takes a few surviving queens to start new colonies, and because these hornets can fly long distances, continued monitoring is crucial. Despite their fearsome reputation, Asian giant hornets don't go out of their way to attack humans, but if provoked, their sting is extremely painful and can be dangerous if multiple stings are received. Beekeepers and researchers working near hornet nests wear full protective suits to avoid injury. The story of Asian giant hornet is a rare case where humans caught an invasive species early enough to possibly stop it. But it's also a reminder of how vulnerable our pollinators are to new threats. So the next time you hear the buzz about murder hornets, remember, the real danger isn't to people, but to the bees that keep our ecosystems and our dinner tables alive.
Citrus psyllid. Picture a sun-drenched citrus grove in Florida or California. Rows of orange trees heavy with fruit, the smell of blossoms in the air. Now zoom in, way in, to a tiny insect no bigger than a grain of rice. This is the Asian citrus psyllid, a pest so small you might never notice it until your entire orchard starts dying. The psyllid itself doesn't look like much, a little sap-sucking insect that feeds on citrus leaves. But the real danger isn't the bug, it's what it carries, a bacterium that causes Quanglongbing, or HLB, also called citrus greening disease. When psyllids feed, they inject this bacterium into the tree, and that's when the nightmare begins. Greening disease clogs the tree's phloem, the tissue that transports nutrients. The leaves turn yellow, the fruit stays green and bitter, and eventually the entire tree withers and dies. Once a tree is infected, there's no cure. Farmers can only remove and destroy it to keep the infection from spreading. The impact has been catastrophic. In Florida, where citrus is a cornerstone of the economy, greening disease has killed tens of millions of trees and reduced orange production by more than 70% since the early 2000s. Entire family farms have gone under. Infected groves look like ghost orchards, twisted, leafless trees standing over rotting fruit that will never ripen. And it's not just Florida. The psyllid has spread across much of the southern U.S., as well as parts of Mexico, Brazil, and Asia, threatening citrus industries worldwide. California's $3 billion citrus sector has been on high alert for years, with aggressive monitoring programs to detect and remove infected trees as quickly as possible. The economic stakes are enormous. Citrus isn't just about orange juice. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that supports thousands of jobs, from growers and harvesters to truckers and juice processors. And for consumers, it means higher prices and less availability of fresh oranges, grapefruits, and other citrus products. Fighting the psyllid has become an ongoing battle. Farmers use insecticides,
biological controls like releasing parasite wasps that attack psyllid eggs, and even heat treatments on infected young trees. Scientists are working on genetically engineered citrus varieties that can resist greening disease, but that solution is still years away. The psyllid story is a reminder that some of the most devastating invasions aren't dramatic or visible. They're microscopic. You don't see the trees screaming. You just wake up one season to find the fruit gone and the grove dying. So the next time you sip a glass of orange juice, remember that sweet sunny drink is under threat from an insect smaller than your fingernail, and an entire industry is racing to stop it before it's too late.
Crazy ants. Picture this. You flip on the lights in your Texas garage and notice the floor looks like it's moving. It's not your eyes playing tricks. It's a swarm of crazy ants, millions of them, running in frantic, erratic patterns that look like chaos on fast forward. And they're not just invading your home. They might be about to fry your air conditioning unit. Crazy ants, also called tawny crazy ants or raspberry crazy ants, named after the exterminator who first identified them, are an invasive species from South America that showed up in Texas in the early 2000s. They earned their name because of their frantic, unpredictable running patterns. Unlike fire ants, which march in organized lines, crazy ants seem to just scatter everywhere at once. But their real superpower, and the reason they've made headlines, is their relationship with electricity. For reasons scientists are still studying, crazy ants are attracted to electrical currents. They swarm into circuit boxes, transformers, and appliances, chewing through wiring and shorting equipment. In some cases, they've shut down entire sewage plants, air conditioning systems, and even airport control towers. Their numbers are staggering. A single colony can grow to billions of individuals, spreading across entire neighborhoods. Homeowners report vacuuming up pounds of ants every day, only to find them back the next morning. Unlike fire ants, which build mounds, crazy ants live under debris, mulch, or even inside walls, making them hard to find and even harder to kill. And while you might think they'd compete with other invasive ants, they actually displace fire ants entirely. That sounds like good news. Fire ants are hated across the South. But it's not that simple. Fire ants, as nasty as they are, do control some agricultural pests. When crazy ants take over, those pest populations can actually rebound, causing new crop problems. They also affect wildlife. Crazy ants swarm over ground-nesting birds, lizards, and even small mammals, delivering formic acid that can blind or kill them. Scientists have found areas where native insects and spiders have been almost completely wiped out after crazy ants invaded. Controlling them is difficult. Standard ant baits don't work because crazy ants don't forage in predictable trails, and their colonies have multiple queens, making them resilient. Pest control experts often have to use a combination of perimeter treatments and repeated applications just to keep them at bay. The invasion is still spreading across the southern U.S., and scientists are working on new biological controls, including a microsporidian fungus that specifically infects crazy ants. Early results are promising, but it will take time before it can be deployed widely.
So the next time your lights flicker and you hear a strange buzzing from your breaker box, don't just call an electrician. Check for ants. You might be dealing with one of the strangest, most destructive insect invasions in modern history.
Argentine ants. Picture a city the size of a country, filled with millions of identical citizens who never fight with each other, working together as one unstoppable army. Sounds like science fiction, but it's real, and it's happening under your feet. Meet the Argentine ant, one of the most successful invasive species on the planet. Argentine ants are small brownish ants native to South America, but they've spread almost everywhere humans go: California, Europe, Australia, Japan, South Africa. Hitchhiking in soil, potted plants, and cargo. Wherever they land, they do something extraordinary. They form super colonies, uniting multiple nests into one massive cooperative network. In their native range, Argentine ants fight with each other, keeping their numbers balanced. But outside of South America, they lose those internal rivalries. Suddenly, ants from different nests don't see each other as enemies. They merge forces. The result? Colonies stretching for hundreds, even thousands of miles. In Southern California, there's a single Argentine ant supercolony that runs nearly the entire length of the state's coastline. In Europe, one massive colony stretches over 6,000 kilometers, the largest cooperative unit ever recorded in any insect species. This teamwork gives them a terrifying advantage over native ants. When they move into an area, they overwhelm local ant colonies with sheer numbers, killing them off and taking their food sources. Species like harvester ants, which are critical seed dispersers, vanish. This creates ripple effects. Some lizards and birds that rely on those native ants for food start to decline as well. Argentine ants don't stop with other ants. They also farm aphids, protecting them from predators in exchange for their sugary honeydew, which means aphid populations boom and plants suffer from increased sap-sucking damage. They invade homes, too, forming endless trails through kitchens and pantries in search of anything sweet or greasy. Controlling them is notoriously hard. Because they form super colonies, killing a single nest barely makes a dent. There are countless others connected to it. And since they don't have a single queen, but multiple queens per colony, their reproduction rate is off the charts. Pesticides can temporarily knock their numbers down, but they often rebound quickly. Scientists are exploring more targeted methods, like baits laced with insect growth regulators that spread through the entire colony, or even viruses that might only infect Argentine ants. What's fascinating and a little unsettling is that these super colonies around the world are genetically so similar that ants from California will greet ants from Japan as friends, not foes. It's like a single global ant empire slowly spreading across continents. So next time you see a neat little trail of ants marching across your counter, remember, it might not just be one colony. It could be a small outpost of a super colony that spans countries, one piece of an invasive force that's quietly taking over ecosystems all around the world. Spotted lanternfly. Picture a tree in late summer, its trunk crawling with dozens of strange, polka-dotted insects. They leap into the air when disturbed, their wings flashing bright red. They look almost pretty, like living confetti, but don't be fooled. This is the spotted lanternfly, and it's become one of the most destructive invasive pests in the United States. The spotted lanternfly is native to China, but it was first detected in Pennsylvania in 2014, likely arriving as egg masses hidden on shipping materials or stone imports. Since then, it has spread across multiple states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, New Jersey, New York, Delaware, Maryland, and beyond, and it's still on the move. What makes them such a threat is their feeding style. Lanternflies are sapsuckers. They use a piercing mouthpart to tap into the phloem of trees and vines, sucking out nutrients. While this alone doesn't always kill the plant, the stress weakens it over time, making it more vulnerable to disease and other pests. But their real calling card is the honeydew they excrete, a sticky, sugary liquid that coats everything beneath infested trees. This goo encourages sooty mold to grow, turning leaves black and further reducing photosynthesis. If you park your car under an infested tree, you might find it covered in sticky residue and mold within days. And they're not picky. Lanternflies attack over 70 plant species, including hardwood trees, fruit trees, hops, and especially grapevines. Vineyards in Pennsylvania and New York have seen entire harvests wiped out, with growers reporting millions in losses. In some cases, vines die completely after repeated infestations. That means this little bug isn't just a nuisance, it's a direct threat to the wine industry. The invasion has become so bad that states have issued quarantine zones where businesses must inspect vehicles and shipments to avoid spreading egg masses to new areas. Public awareness campaigns urge people to stomp it out, literally, encouraging citizens to kill lanternflies on sight and scrape egg masses off surfaces in fall and winter. Controlling them is tricky. They're strong jumpers and can hitch rides on cars, trucks, or trains, spreading much faster than eradication teams can keep up. Researchers are experimenting with biocontrol options, like releasing parasitic wasps from their native range. But these programs take years to implement safely. Until then, the spotted lanternfly remains a highly visible, highly annoying symbol of invasive species. People living in infested areas report swarms covering trees, walls, and decks, raining sticky residue all summer long. So the next time you see a pretty gray insect with black spots and flashing red wings, don't admire it. Squash it. Behind that splash of color is an invader threatening forests, orchards, and the wine in your glass.
Yellow crazy ants. Imagine a remote tropical island where every year millions of bright red crabs march from the forest to the sea to breed. The entire forest floor comes alive, a moving carpet of crabs that's so iconic it attracts tourists from all over the world. Now imagine that one day the crabs are simply gone. The forest feels empty, eerily quiet. The culprit, Yellow crazy ants, one of the most destructive invasive insects ever recorded. Yellow crazy ants are native to Southeast Asia, but they arrived on Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean sometime in the early 20th century, likely hidden in shipping cargo. For decades they were present, but not dominant. Then, in the late 1980s and 1990s, their populations exploded, forming super colonies with billions of ants spread across huge areas of forest. Here's where things get wild. These ants spray formic acid as a weapon, and when they swarm, they can overwhelm even large animals. On Christmas Island, they began attacking and killing the island's most famous residents, the red land crabs. These crabs aren't just cute. They're ecological engineers. They eat leaf litter, keeping the forest floor clear, and their constant burrowing helps aerate the soil. When yellow crazy ants killed millions of crabs, the forest floor changed almost overnight. Leaf litter piled up, altering soil chemistry. Weeds and invasive plants began to take over, changing the very makeup of the forest. Even some native animals that relied on crabs for food or shared their burrows started to disappear. And it's not just crabs at risk. Crazy ants also attack bird chicks and invertebrates, reducing biodiversity across the island. Their dominance creates what scientists call an invasional meltdown. When one invasive species, the ants, disrupts so much of the ecosystem that it allows other invasives, like weeds, to thrive even more. Efforts to control yellow crazy ants have been massive. On Christmas Island, aerial baiting programs using ant-specific poisons have been deployed to knock back their numbers. These operations are expensive and must be repeated to keep ant populations from rebounding. Without them, entire crab populations could be wiped out permanently. What's especially eerie is how silent the forests became after the crabs were gone. Researchers reported that walking through former crab strongholds felt completely different. No rustling, no movement, just stillness. It's a chilling reminder of how one tiny invader can transform an entire ecosystem. Today, thanks to control efforts, some areas are seeing red crab numbers recover, but the fight is ongoing. So the next time you see footage of that world-famous red crab migration, remember, it's not just a beautiful natural spectacle. It's also a survival story as those crabs march through a landscape still threatened by one of the most relentless ant armies on Earth.
Gypsy moths. Picture a lush green forest in late spring, leaves just fully unfurled, birds singing, the air warm and fresh. Now imagine coming back a month later and finding the trees completely bare, like winter has returned overnight. No leaves, no shade, just the sound of millions of chewing mouths. That's what happens during a gypsy moth outbreak, one of the most dramatic insect invasions in North America. The gypsy moth, recently renamed the spongy moth, was introduced in Massachusetts in the late 1800s by a French scientist trying to breed a better silkworm. The moths escaped, and the rest is ecological history. They spread slowly at first, but today they infest forests from New England to the Midwest, and they're still expanding their range. The destruction comes from the caterpillars. When they hatch in spring, they start eating, and they don't stop. Each caterpillar can eat a square meter of leaves in its lifetime. When copulations boom, there can be millions of caterpillars per acre, and they can strip entire forests in a matter of weeks. The result is eerie. Defoliated trees stand like skeletons, letting sunlight flood the forest floor. The caterpillars leave behind frass, a polite word for poop, that rains down like gritty pellets, and the sound of their chewing is so loud you can actually hear it, like a soft, constant rainfall. Most healthy trees can survive a single defoliation, but repeated outbreaks weaken them, making them vulnerable to disease, drought, and other pests. Oaks, birches, aspens, and willows are their favorite targets. But during big outbreaks, they'll even eat conifers, like pines and spruces, which often die after losing their needles. The impact ripples through the ecosystem. Birds lose nesting cover. Shade-loving plants wilt in the sudden sun, and streams heat up without the cooling canopy, harming fish like trout. In urban areas, the loss of tree cover means higher cooling costs and more heat buildup in summer. Controlling gypsy moths has been a major effort for decades. Early on, chemical sprays were used, but now more targeted methods are preferred, like BTK, a bacteria that kills caterpillars but spares most other insects, and pheromone flakes that disrupt mating. In some places, natural predators like viruses and fungi help collapse outbreaks on their own. But until that happens, the damage can be severe. Despite control efforts, gypsy moth outbreaks still flare up every few years, reminding everyone how fast an insect invasion can transform a landscape. So the next time you're in a forest and notice the leaves look a little too sparse for the season, listen closely. If you hear a soft, creepy rustling coming from above, you might just be standing in the middle of a silent army of caterpillars, eating their way through the canopy.
Bumblebee parasites. Picture a summer meadow buzzing with life. Fat, fuzzy bumblebees zigzagging between flowers, pollinating clover and wildflowers as they go. It looks healthy, vibrant, and timeless. But there's an invisible problem hitching a ride on some of those bees. A problem that's quietly contributing to the decline of wild pollinators worldwide. This story starts with good intentions. Farmers rely on pollination for crops like tomatoes, berries, and peppers. To make sure they get enough pollination, they use commercial bumblebee colonies, big boxes of bees bred in facilities and shipped to farms. These managed pollinators are a huge part of modern agriculture. But here's the catch.
When you breed bees in massive numbers in confined spaces, you also breed parasites and diseases. Pathogens like Nosema bombi, a gut parasite, or viruses such as deformed wing virus can spread rapidly in these commercial colonies. When those bees are released into greenhouses or fields, they don't stay put. They interact with wild bees at flowers, passing along infections like an insect version of a pandemic. Over time, scientists have found strong links between areas with heavy use of commercial bumblebees and declines in local wild bee populations. In North America, species like the rusty-patched bumblebee have seen population crashes of more than 80%, and disease spillover is thought to be one of the culprits. The effect is devastating because wild bumblebees are keystone pollinators. They buzz-pollinate certain flowers that honeybees can't, which means losing them not only reduces bee diversity, it actually threatens whole plant communities. Fewer wild bees means fewer wild flowers, which means less food for other insects, birds, and mammals. It's a domino effect that ripples through entire ecosystems. What makes this story extra unsettling is that it's hard to see. You won't notice a sick bumblebee at first glance. The meadow still looks alive until one day there are fewer and fewer bees, and the silence creeps in. Scientists and conservationists are now working to reduce the risk of disease spillover. Some countries have banned the import of commercial bumblebees to protect native populations. Others are pushing for stricter health checks on managed colonies before they're shipped to farms. And researchers are encouraging farmers to plant more wildflower habitat so wild bees can thrive alongside commercial ones instead of being slowly pushed out. The bumblebee parasite story is a reminder that not all invasions are loud, obvious, or caused by a single rogue species. Sometimes they're microscopic, traveling from one population to another because of choices we made. So the next time you see a bumblebee buzzing around a flower, remember, that little insect is part of a much bigger story, one where the fight isn't just about keeping invasive species out, but also about keeping the invisible diseases we've spread under control.
Zebra mussels. Picture a summer day at the beach on Lake Michigan. You wade into the water, step on something sharp, and pull up your foot to find it covered in tiny striped shells. Those are zebra mussels, and they're more than just a nuisance for swimmers. They're one of the most destructive, invasive species in North American waters. Zebra mussels are small, fingernail-sized mollusks native to Eastern Europe. They arrived in the Great Lakes in the 1980s, most likely as stowaways in the ballast water of cargo ships. Once they got here, they exploded in number. A single female can produce up to 1 million eggs a year, and the larvae drift with the current, spreading quickly to every corner of the lake system. These mussels are filter feeders, which sounds like a good thing at first because they make the water crystal clear. But clear water isn't always healthy water. By removing huge amounts of plankton from the water column, zebra mussels starve native species like larval fish and other filter feeders. This reshapes the entire food web, leaving fewer nutrients available for everything higher up the chain. They also attach to anything: rocks, docks, boats, even other mussels. They form dense, razor-sharp colonies that can number tens of thousands per square meter, smothering native mussels and coating every hard surface. This biofouling clogs intake pipes for power plants and municipal water systems, costing billions of dollars in maintenance and cleaning. The ripple effects keep going. Because zebra mussels filter so efficiently, more sunlight penetrates the water, which allows algae, especially toxic blue-green algae, to grow in places it never used to. This leads to massive algal blooms and dead zones when the algae die and decompose, sucking oxygen out of the water. And then there's the botulism problem. Zebra mussels change the lake chemistry in a way that favors the growth of bacteria that produce botulism toxin. Fish and birds that eat contaminated prey can die in huge numbers. Mass die-offs of waterfowl on the Great Lakes have been linked to this cascade effect. Fighting zebra mussels is a nightmare. Once they're in a body of water, eradication is practically impossible. The focus is on preventing their spread to new lakes by requiring boaters to clean, drain, and dry their equipment before moving between water bodies. New technologies like anti-fouling coatings and specialized water treatments are being developed, but keeping up with their reproduction is like bailing water from a sinking ship. So the next time you see a clear blue lake in the Great Lakes region, know that its beauty might be deceiving. Beneath the surface, millions of tiny mussels are busy re-engineering the ecosystem, one filter-feeding gulp at a time, and leaving behind a trail of clogged pipes and ecological upheaval.
Quagga mussels. If you thought zebra mussels were bad, meet their quieter, more efficient cousin, the quagga mussel. These small, stripy invaders look a lot like zebra mussels, and they hitched a ride to the Great Lakes the same way, arriving in ballast water from ships in the 1980s. But quagga mussels have gone one step further, taking the zebra mussel invasion and turning it up to 11. Quagga mussels have one key advantage. They can live in deeper, colder water than zebra mussels. While zebra mussels mostly colonize shallow areas, quaggas spread across the lake floor, carpeting huge stretches of bottom that zebras never touched. In places like Lake Michigan, scientists estimate that quagga mussels now make up over 90% of the mussel population, filtering nearly the entire volume of the lake every few days. That filtration might make the water look clear and beautiful, but it's an ecological mirage. By removing plankton and nutrients from the water column, quagga mussels starve the base of the food chain. Tiny fish that depend on plankton decline, which means fewer prey for bigger fish like salmon and lake trout. The entire ecosystem shifts toward an unnatural state where most of the lake's energy is locked up in mussels sitting on the bottom. And just like zebra mussels, quaggas smother native mussels, encrust infrastructure, and clog water intake pipes, but they do it on a much bigger scale. They've been found as deep as 400 feet, meaning no part of the lake is safe from their takeover. Then there's the issue of algal blooms. By clearing the water, quaggas allow more sunlight to penetrate, which stimulates algae growth on the lake bed. When that algae dies, it decomposes and creates low-oxygen dead zones. This not only kills fish, but also fosters the growth of Clostridium botulinum bacteria, which produce a toxin that causes mass die-offs of birds and fish. Entire shorelines have been littered with dead gulls, loons, and fish after these botulism events, a grim side effect of what looks like cleaner water. Quagga mussels have also spread beyond the Great Lakes, invading rivers and reservoirs across the Midwest and West, including Lake Mead and Lake Powell, two major water sources for millions of people. Managing them is expensive and time-consuming, requiring constant scraping and chemical treatments to keep pipes and turbines clear. The scary part? There's no known way to eliminate them once they establish. Prevention is the only real weapon. Cleaning boats, draining bilges, and stopping the spread to new lakes. But each new body of water they reach, the cleanup bill and the ecological damage only grows. So the next time you see a crystal-clear stretch of Lake Michigan or a western reservoir, remember, that clarity might not be a sign of health. It might be the work of trillions of quagga mussels, silently filtering the life out of the water.
Asian shore crabs. Picture walking along a rocky tide pool on the east coast, flipping over stones, expecting to see a few small crabs scuttling away. Instead, dozens, maybe hundreds, scramble in every direction. This is the new normal in many parts of the northeastern United States, thanks to the Asian shore crab, a small but mighty invader that's rewriting the rules of coastal life. Asian shore crabs are native to the rocky shores of the Western Pacific, places like Japan, China, and Korea. They arrived in the U.S. sometime in the late 1980s, likely as stowaways in the ballast water of cargo ships. By the time scientists noticed them in New Jersey in 1988, they had already begun spreading rapidly up and down the coast. What makes them so successful is their sheer adaptability. They live under rocks, in tide pools, on jetties, anywhere with a bit of shelter. They can tolerate a wide range of temperatures and salinities, which means they thrive from Maine all the way down to the Carolinas. And they breed like crazy. Females can produce several broods per year, releasing tens of thousands of larvae each time. The problem is what happened to the native crabs. Asian shore crabs directly outcompete species like green crabs and mud crabs for food and habitat. They're aggressive, fast, and willing to eat just about anything: algae, worms, mussels, barnacles, even juvenile fish. Over time, they crowd out natives, leaving tide pools dominated almost entirely by Asian shore crabs, and that changes the whole community. Fewer native crabs mean shifts in predation pressure on other species, which can affect mussel beds, snail populations, and even the availability of prey for larger predators like fish and birds. Some researchers have found that where Asian shore crabs take over, the diversity of tide pool life drops significantly. The ripple effect doesn't stop there. These crabs also compete with juvenile lobsters for shelter, potentially impacting lobster fisheries in the long term. For coastal economies that depend on lobsters and shellfish, that's a serious concern. Managing Asian shore crabs is challenging because they're small, numerous, and live in hard-to-reach places. Hand collecting can make a dent in small areas. There are even crab harvest events where volunteers gather them for research or cooking, but large-scale eradication is virtually impossible. The best strategy now is monitoring their spread and trying to protect vulnerable areas,
like key lobster nursery habitats, before they become completely overrun. So the next time you visit a rocky beach in New England and see dozens of tiny crabs under every stone, know that you're looking at an invasion in progress, one that's quietly turning the tide on native species, one tide pool at a time.
Signal crayfish. Picture a quiet European stream, the kind where kids might go looking for crayfish under stones. For centuries, these waters were home to native crayfish, slow-moving, night-active creatures that kept the ecosystem balanced. Now imagine flipping over a rock and finding a much larger, more aggressive crayfish staring back, a signal crayfish, an American import. It looks healthy, but here's the dark twist. It's carrying a deadly plague that's wiping out its European cousins. Signal crayfish are native to North America, but in the mid-20th century, they were intentionally introduced to Europe, especially the UK and Scandinavia, to boost crayfish harvests after native populations were hit by disease. The idea was simple: replace dying native crayfish with the hardier, faster-growing species that could still support the fishery. But there was a catch. Signal crayfish are carriers of the crayfish plague, a water mold called Aphanomyces astachi that doesn't hurt them, but is almost always fatal to European crayfish. When signals were released, they didn't just replace natives. They became walking disease vectors, spreading the plague through streams and rivers. Within decades, entire populations of native white-clawed crayfish collapsed. And the damage doesn't stop at disease. Signal crayfish are bigger, more aggressive, and dig deep burrows into riverbanks, which causes erosion and destabilizes the banks. They also outcompete native crayfish for food and shelter, and prey on fish eggs, aquatic insects, and even small amphibians, reducing biodiversity even further. Today, in many European rivers, signal crayfish are the dominant species, and native crayfish survive only in isolated, plague-free pockets, often in specially protected refuges, or in artificial ark sites where conservationists have relocated them. Control is incredibly difficult. Signals are tough, reproduce quickly, and are hard to trap in numbers large enough to make a difference. In some areas, trapping programs aim to keep populations low enough to give native crayfish a chance, but eradication is almost never possible once they establish. Interestingly, some chefs and foragers have embraced signal crayfish as a food source, holding crayfish boils as both a cultural tradition and a control measure. Eating them won't solve the problem completely, but every crayfish removed is one less plague carrier in the water. The story of the signal crayfish is one of those tragic cases where a human solution made the problem worse. People were trying to save crayfish fisheries, and instead they unleashed an invader that made the native species extinction even more likely. So, the next time you see a big, healthy crayfish in a European river, don't assume that's a good sign. It might be a signal crayfish, a survivor that's slowly, silently erasing its smaller, native cousins from the map.
Green crabs. Picture a quiet coastal mudflat at low tide. It's dotted with clams, mussels, and small crabs, a rich buffet for seabirds, and a backbone of local fisheries. Now imagine an invader moving in, a small but fierce crab that tears through this buffet like an unstoppable eating machine. This is the European green crab, and it's one of the most damaging marine invaders on the planet. Green crabs are native to Europe and North Africa, but they've spread around the world, including Australia, South Africa, parts of Asia, and both coasts of North America. They likely traveled in ballast water of ships or clung to seaweed used for packing bait worms. Once introduced, they quickly established themselves in tidal flats, estuaries, and salt marshes. Here's why they're such a problem. Green crabs are voracious predators. They eat clams, mussels, oysters, and young crabs, and they're extremely efficient hunters. In some invaded areas, they've been blamed for wiping out entire shellfish beds. In New England, for example, green crabs have devastated soft-shell clam populations, costing millions in lost harvests. They're also ecosystem engineers, but in the worst way. Green crabs dig up seagrass beds while foraging, which destroys critical habitat for juvenile fish and shellfish. Their constant disturbance of the sediment leads to erosion and habitat loss, which has knock-on effects for everything from commercially important fish to migratory birds that rely on healthy marshes. And they breed fast. A single female can produce up to 185,000 eggs per year, and their larvae can drift for weeks, allowing them to colonize new areas quickly. They also tolerate a wide range of temperatures and salinities, which means they can survive in places where many other crabs can't. Controlling green crabs is a massive challenge. Trapping programs have been set up in multiple countries, removing thousands of crabs each year, but their numbers often bounce back. In some places, researchers are exploring creative solutions, like encouraging chefs to add green crabs to menus, turning them into food. Soft-shell green crab sandwiches are now a thing in New England. Others are experimenting with targeted baits, or using them as compost to make use of the huge biomass they represent. In Australia, green crabs are particularly concerning because they threaten native shellfish and aquaculture operations. Efforts are underway to keep them from spreading into key fisheries areas, but as with most invasive species, once they're established, total eradication is nearly impossible. The story of the green crab shows how a small, hand-sized invader can transform entire coastlines, not with brute force, but with sheer numbers and insatiable appetite. So the next time you walk along a tidal flat and see a little green crab scuttling away, remember, you're looking at one of the world's most notorious marine invaders, a creature that's reshaping coastlines one clam at a time.